Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our in-house guests, we would ask that courtesy check that our mobile devices of various sorts and kinds have been turned off or silenced as a courtesy to our speakers. Thank you, Paul. And for those watching online, you're reminded you're welcome to send questions at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post today's program on our homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Leading our discussion and organizing our program today is my colleague, Paul Larkin. Mr. Larkin serves as Senior Legal Research Fellow in the Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Please join me in welcoming him. Paul?
Thank you, John. And thank you, everyone here or watching on TV, for spending this part of your day with us. You will hear from the nation's premier experts today about a major public policy problem that has received far too little discussion in the media and in the public arena. Namely, the contribution that driving under the influence of drugs, known by the acronym DUID, makes to morbidity and mortality on the nation's highways. For more than a century, the nation has known that driving under the influence of alcohol leads to crashes and death. Nevertheless, it took decades before we could see results in trying to reduce the carnage on our highways, carnage that the Supreme Court once described as paralleling only what is seen in warfare. Before the existence of breathalyzers, police officers had to give testimony based on a subjective perception of whether someone was driving in an impaired manner. Plus, driving was popular, drinking was glamorized, critics of driving under the influence of alcohol were labeled and criticized as being prohibitionists, and juries and judges were lenient because they thought there, but for the grace of God, go I. Fortunately, that day has passed. Through the work of public and private experts, like the ones you will hear from today, the nation no longer tolerates drunk drivers. Every state uses a 0.08 grams per deciliter blood alcohol content standard to deem people intoxicated as a matter of law. The police use safe, reliable, inoffensive breathalyzers to determine whether someone pulled over for driving erratically or in a potentially inebriated state have violated that BAC standard. The result? Over the last 30 years, there has been a material decrease in drunk driving and alcohol-induced crashes, leading to morbidity and mortality on our highways. Regrettably, we have addressed only part of the problem. Alcohol is not the only psychoactive substance. It's not the only substance that can lead to impaired driving. Drugs such as opiates and marijuana also can have that effect. The opiate epidemic that we are witnessing, along with the decision by some states to liberalize their laws dealing with the medical and recreational use of marijuana, pose the risk of undoing the benefits that we have seen over the last 30 years in reducing injuries and fatalities on our highways due to impaired driving. Moreover, the states will find it difficult automatically to apply to drug-induced impairment the same protocols that we use for alcohol-induced impairment. Now, there are options available, however, and they should be used. You will hear about some of them today. We have two panels coming up. In keeping with the title of this event, Drugged Driving, What is the Problem? What are the Solutions? The first panel will address the question of what problem drugged driving causes. The second panel will address some of the solutions. What they have to say is well worth your time. As the saying goes, from their lips to God's ears. Before, however, we start with our first panel, we will hear from our keynote speaker, Heidi King. Ms. King is the Deputy Administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, an organization devoted to reducing morbidity and mortality on our roads. She came to NHTSA with extensive experience in public safety, innovation, risk management, evidence-based decision-making, and law enforcement. An economist and research scientist by training, Ms. King received degrees from the California Institute of Technology and the University of California at Irvine. In the private sector, she worked at Telcordia Technologies, a research and development company. She was also senior manager of the Management Science Division at Pfizer and global director of environmental risk at General Electric. In earlier government service, Ms. King was a regulatory policy analyst in the White House Office of Management and Budget and spent 2 years as chief economist on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. But she also knows what it means to get her hands dirty and address problems at the retail level. Aside from the positions I have mentioned, Ms. King was a California State Park Ranger and also spent 7 years gaining firsthand experience in the field of safety by working as a volunteer emergency medical technician. She is more than eminently qualified to open today's events. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Ms. Heidi King.
Thank you very, very much. Very kind introduction. Alongside the Pacific Ocean, there is a scenic beach cove. It's a quiet stretch of road, trees on both sides of the road. I think they're cypress trees. And I often think of a young couple that lost their lives there. More than 30 years ago, the young couple was returning home from a celebration, driving impaired. I believe it was a graduation party. And that night, their car left the road and crashed into a tree. The crew of park rangers and rescuers, the emergency medical responders, were unable to save that young couple. My husband at the time was one of the rescuers. He returned home in the late, dark, early morning hours, exhausted and in despair. A few hours later, I was on patrol as a state park ranger. The sun was out, the beach was warming, the sand was shining in the sun, the water was glistening, and beachgoers were arriving to the beach with their picnic baskets and their beach chairs, walking out across the sand, unaware of what had happened a few hours earlier, right there at that same spot. The scene had been cleared, of course. The debris had been cleaned up. The beachgoers stepped over it, not knowing what had happened. I could see, though, knowing what had happened, the little bits of glass and the little bits of plastic, the little red pieces from a taillight tucked in among the brush. And I still reflect on that haunting, haunting contrast between the terrible, terrible aftermath of an auto crash from impaired driving and the idyllic beach scene a few hours later, only hours later. Despite all that we've learned as a nation, the loss of life from impaired driving continues. I worry that as a nation, we are like those beachgoers, unaware of the loss of life from impaired driving, stepping over the bits of glass and the bits of plastic as we go about our day, and not acknowledging the loss of life in our communities that result from drug-impaired driving. So changing gears, imagine a very different world in which a college student maybe is ready to leave a party and is feeling a little high, and her friends recognize this and call an Uber or call a Lyft or give her a ride home. Or a world in which maybe a parent in the afternoon is getting ready to pick up the kids for carpool, but realizes, he or she has taken more than the prescribed amount of a pain medicine and realizes, this isn't a good idea for me to be driving, so that parent calls another parent in the carpool and has that parent pick up the kids instead. Imagine a world in which members of our community know that it's dangerous to drive while impaired from a diverse set of substances, and that we all, as communities and as a nation, take steps to keep impaired drivers off our roads and keep our roads safe. Imagine that world, a future with safer roads, safer drivers. At NHTSA, as most of you know, our mission is to save lives, to prevent injuries, and to reduce the economic costs resulting from automotive crashes. As most of you are aware, fatalities on our roads have been increasing proportionately in recent years. In 2016 and 2015, those combined 2 years, we saw in the United States a proportionate increase in the number of fatalities from auto crashes, such that we have not seen in my lifetime. 37,461 people died on our highways in the United States. 37,461 friends, neighbors, colleagues, people in our community, law enforcement officers, and emergency rescuers have died on our highways in 2016. We have to ask ourselves why. And some of the answers are known. They're well understood. We know that, for instance, an increase in the miles traveled will often result in an increase in auto crashes and the resulting fatalities. We know that there are more pedestrians on our roadways and more bicycles because people are choosing to transport themselves in a different way than they have in the past. We know that we've made great strides, as Paul mentioned, in alcohol-impaired driving, and alcohol-impaired driving is on the decline, but it's still a problem. It's still, good grief, nearly 30% of traffic fatalities involve someone who has a blood alcohol level of 0.08 grams per deciliter or more after all these years. So that's what we know, but there is still much that we do not know. We believe and we see evidence that distraction is an issue, but the data doesn't seem to be capturing the full side of the story. Many believe that the data underreport the magnitude of distracted driving. Increasingly, we see evidence that we hear from law enforcement that drug impairment in our drivers is a growing problem. We believe that from the existing data and from what we're hearing from the field, that increased use of recreational drugs and the opioid epidemic are contributing to a new epidemic of drug-impaired driving on our roadways. Of course, the first priority for all of us, and particularly at NHTSA, is in fact the safety of our roads, protecting life and limb. Drug-impaired driving is dangerous, and highway fatalities are unacceptable. Traffic crashes cause injuries and disabilities, but they also cause economic costs. NHTSA has estimated that the economic cost of motor vehicle crashes that occurred just in 2010 to be $242 billion. This is equivalent to about $784 for every person living in the United States, 1.6% of GDP, gross domestic product. That's a lot of economic value. So again, our first priority, lives, protecting people from injury, saving lives, but in fact, this is also an economic issue. When we factor in the loss of quality of life and other values associated with the harm from auto crashes, the estimates increase even more. That's why at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, we are launching an initiative to combat drug-impaired driving, starting with a call to action on March 15th of this year. At that event, we will, and also in the coming years and weeks, bring together experts and stakeholders to raise awareness across the nation, to share best practices to begin saving lives now, to set a path forward towards collecting consistent data, to developing better use of testing protocols, to measuring driver impairment levels, and to support the enforcement of impaired driving from illicit drug use. It's important to me, it's very important to me, that we define a vision of what we are seeking to accomplish together as a nation in the coming years, so that each of us, working together and independently, can contribute towards the goal of safer roads in the United States. Many of the experts in the room know the challenges are not insignificant. This is an issue many of us have been working on for years. It's not simple. We're not talking about one water-soluble substance. We're talking about many substances with different characteristics. But I am confident we can do this. We must do this. Officers tell me that drivers are mixing drugs and mixing drugs with alcohol. I hear from public safety experts in the field that many people know it's dangerous to drive and illegal to drive drunk, so they think it's okay to drive high instead because they're not going to get caught. We need to fix that. This complexity, the complexity of mixing substances and mixing substances with alcohol to mask the alcohol, makes the challenge more daunting, but also more urgent. So, what do we need to do to get to a safer future? The crisis on our roads calls for a combination of policies, research, and action. It requires committed and sustained effort from state, local, and federal governments, from highway safety partners, from schools, from communities. We can no longer tolerate our own ignorance of this critical threat to safety on our roads. We must engage in the difficult but critical discussion and launch a national dialogue to reduce the loss of life caused by driving under the influence of drugs. There is much we don't know, and it's incredibly frustrating to you and to me, particularly when we see fatality increases such as we have seen in recent years. But by working together through this conference and through other initiatives, we will fill in the blanks together and improve our understanding of the problem and the solutions that we might and will employ. I'd like to start with focusing on public awareness to drive individual action. When we talk about impaired driving, it's tempting to turn immediately to discussion of law enforcement and traffic stops, lab tests, and prosecution strategies, and those are very important. But in an ideal world, individuals would be equipped with an understanding of the risks and a knowledge of their own impairment so that they can make good decisions in deciding whether or not to drive. We know that public schools' driver education programs are on the decline. The programs, the classes that I and many of you took in the 70s and 80s as required curriculum, we're not seeing that level of education in our schools anymore. We have to reach drivers in new and other ways. It's more urgent than ever that we develop public education tools and campaigns to educate not only drivers, but the individuals around them, so they will make better decisions when deciding to operate a 4,000-pound vehicle on our roadways. But we, of course, also need policies for improved enforcement. We do need enforceability. We need more officers trained in advanced roadside impaired driving enforcement, the A-RIDE program. We need more drug recognition experts, the DRE program. And we need more equipment and robust, repeatable toxicological programs or protocols for testing lab samples. We need more prosecutors trained and confident in the prosecution of drug-impaired driving cases. That's a lot of work, but we can do this. We have a few things in our favor. We have, first of all, the people, the experts in this room participating here today and engaged in similar dialogues across the country. We can build upon public awareness and programs that are developed for alcohol-impaired program. We can build upon the tools and relationships that we have already developed over the decades of combating alcohol-impaired driving. I'm excited to learn that some of our communications experts across the United States, in the field, in certain states in particular, have already begun to make strides in communicating the risks of drug-impaired driving to their communities. I'm heartened to learn that some communities have improved their tools for identifying, assessing, and prosecuting drug-impaired driving. There is a long road ahead, but there are lessons we can learn from those who have the early successes so that we can begin to share best practices and start saving lives now and improve the safety of our roads this year. By working together, we can begin to save lives today and prevent thousands of impaired driving auto crashes. In the years to come, I want the young people returning home from a celebration, maybe on that same stretch of road along an idyllic beach in a cove on the Pacific, to arrive home safely, in good health, and able to be with us perhaps in the future. I know we can do this. The mission is too important to fail. So it's an honor to be here today, and I look forward to hearing from all the speakers. Thank you very much.
Heidi, the honor is due to us. Thank you very much. We appreciate not simply the time you took here today and the time in preparation, but all the work you've done in the past and we know you will do in the future on this very important subject. Gang, we will now hear from our first panel of experts. Here is the order in which they will speak, and please feel free to take your seats either when I call your name or go ahead right now. First, we will hear from Dr. Marilyn Huestis. Dr. Huestis is a nationally and internationally known expert for her work on the biochemical and neurobiological aspects of drug use. She worked for 23 years at the National Institute for Drug Abuse in Baltimore, Maryland, where she was the chief of chemistry and drug metabolism. She is now at the Lambert Center for the Study of Medicinal Cannabis and Hemp at Thomas Jefferson University and is an adjunct faculty member at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. She has investigated the effects of psychoactive substances on persons in utero and after birth. She has published more than 400 papers on the subjects of her research, which has most recently focused on the effects of marijuana use on driving impairment. Dr. Huestis has served on various scientific commissions, such as the National Commission on Forensic Science. She's been president of the Society of Forensic Toxicologists and chair of the toxicology section of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. She will be followed by Dr. Jeff Michael. He is the Associate Administrator for Research and Program Development at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. His responsibility is for the development of programs to increase seatbelt use, decrease impaired driving, and improve the safety of motorcyclists, bicyclists, pedestrians, and older drivers, as well as addressing global safety on the road. Previously, he served as the director of the Impaired Driving and Occupant Protection Office, with the responsibility for developing and promoting programs to reduce alcohol and drug-impaired driving. During his tenure, he also served as chief of the agency's Emergency Medical Services Division, where he supported the national EMS system by developing and maintaining consensus guidelines for educating EMTs and improving EMS operations. Dr. Michael has served in the federal government for 29 years. Third will be Dr. Terry Zobek, the acting deputy director of the Office of Policy Research and Budget within the Office of National Drug Control Policy. He oversees the production of the National Drug Control Strategy, the administration's blueprint for addressing international interdiction, domestic law enforcement, prevention and treatment activities, and other subjects to reduce drug use and its consequences. In that role, Dr. Zobek is responsible for research and for policy implementation for the subjects of prevention, treatment, and recovery, as well as public safety. He has been with ONDCP for more than 2 decades. Prior to his federal service, he was a substance abuse researcher for 13 years in the private sector, managing contracts with ONDCP, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and others. If you want to know why drugged driving is a problem, these are the people you should listen to. With that, Dr. Huestis. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good morning. It's not afternoon. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the research that we carried out at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And I'm really happy to be sitting here with Jeff Michaels and Terry Zobek because the support to do this work came from ONDCP and from NHTSA, as well as our budgets at NIDA. And cannabis-impaired driving is certainly one of the most important short-term consequences of the medicalization and legalization of cannabis. But there are others, and so I'm going to focus on cannabis-impaired driving, but we also need to understand that the perception of risk, especially to young people, when they hear that cannabis is a medicine and that it's legal, is at an all-time low. I actually have parents who call me and say, isn't it great? My child is not drinking and driving. They're only smoking marijuana and driving. So it tells you the lack of perception of the public of this as a serious problem. We have many more people ending up in emergency rooms, both children who now can get a hold of all of this very available edible materials, including cannabis, as well as adults with a large increase in hallucinations and psychosis with especially edible cannabis. We also have many more people looking for cannabis dependence treatment because, yes, cannabis is addictive. And then the upside is that we do hope that some of the cannabinoids that are present in the plant may be effective medications for diseases that we don't yet have good answers for. So that's the positive side, we hope. But don't forget the long-term consequences. So I have studied a lot about in utero drug exposure. There are actually obstetricians in Colorado recommending to pregnant women to use cannabis for nausea and vomiting. And we know about the effects of cannabis on the developing brain. So that involves both in utero drug exposure, breastfed infants, secondhand cannabis smoke, but then especially during the time of adolescent development and how cannabinoids really affect the way the brain develops. And we don't even know yet the effects of what constant exposure is going to do to the endogenous cannabinoid system that all of us have in our brain and that has critical functions, reproduction, reasoning, body temperature control, memory, many, many aspects. The cannabinoid system is involved. But now we'll talk about cannabis and driving. And this is the world's most advanced driving simulator. It's called the National Advanced Driving Simulator at the University of Iowa. There's a full car inside this vehicle, this big dome, and it moves very rapidly all over the size of an airplane hangar so that it becomes very realistic. It's 360 degrees around. You have a view, you can control everything, and we can look, for instance, with cameras on people's eyes to see how well they search the environment. If you go over gravel, you not only feel the bumps of gravel, but you hear the crunch, crunch. It's very, very realistic. We're so happy that we were able to do this study on the first illicit drug in this excellent simulator. And what we looked at was the effects of cannabis and low-dose alcohol. So we know that that is a combination that happens all the time. They have a few beers and then they smoke a joint or two. So this was designed, and we have very many papers coming out of this, but I'm just going to give you the highlights. So we first found that if you mix cannabis and alcohol, that the peak alcohol concentration is delayed, significantly delayed. That's really important because people say, well, I've had 2 beers, I can't drive for a couple hours. So that was an important issue. It makes perfect sense because we know that alcohol is primarily absorbed in the small intestine, not in the stomach. And having THC, which is the primary psychoactive component in cannabis, slows gastric emptying. And so you absorb the alcohol later. Even more important, we found that when you mix alcohol, and cannabis, we had a significantly greater maximum concentration of THC. We don't know exactly why this is, but we suppose that the alcohol actually opens up and dilates blood vessels. And when someone smokes the cannabis, they can take more drug in and reach a higher concentration of THC. So you have two drugs on board, alcohol that affects driving and cannabis that affects driving. Now, if we look at lateral control, and lateral control is your ability to stay within your lane, the weaving, the going over the line and having the opportunity to crash with an oncoming vehicle, or going off the roadway and hitting environmental things like trees and other aspects. So when we did this study, because everyone was exposed to alcohol alone, to cannabis alone, and to the combination, as well as placebo, no drugs on board, we were able to show what the concentration of THC was at the time of impaired driving. And we're able to say what that concentration was in relationship to 0.05 alcohol or a 0.08 alcohol. In the US, we have a 0.08 alcohol. In most of the world, it's 0.05. And in the Scandinavian countries, it's 0.02. So it's a decision that the society makes about how much risk you're willing to take. So what is so important about this is an 8.2 nanogram per mil THC concentration produced the same impairment that a 0.05 alcohol would have, and a 13.1 THC concentration produced the same impairment that a 0.08 alcohol would produce. What's critically important is this is the concentrations at the time of driving. And no matter how many times I said this in many press interviews, the population, normal and others, picked it up and said, we need to have much higher cutoffs for THC in blood. It should be 10 or 15 nanograms per mil. Well, one of the things we studied was how quickly the THC concentration decreases in the blood. We sort of knew this before, but we didn't have good hard data. Now we have that data, and we know that in the first 30 minutes that the THC concentration in blood decreases 73.5%. And in the first 1.4 hours, it's decreasing 90%. Why is that important? Because in the United States, it takes between 1.4 and 4 hours to get a blood sample drawn after a crash or a vehicle stop. So you can see that the time it takes to get, in many states, a warrant to get a blood sample drawn, the time to find a hospital or the police station where there may be a phlebotomist, this is a very long time, and therefore the THC concentration has dropped to much lower levels. So this is a huge problem across the United States as people set limits like 5 nanograms per mil, as it's said in Washington State. There is no one number that is going to separate impaired from unimpaired drivers for THC concentration in blood. We know this, we've published this, we've talked about it. What we have to do is demonstrate the impairment and then use a biological test to say what drug is present that might be causing the problem. Now, let's look at longitudinal control. So longitudinal control has to do with the speed with which you operate your vehicle, with variability in speed, and with the distance in front of you that you keep between you and the preceding car. In this experiment, we helped the driver out. We actually told them, keep your needle in the green area. That's to keep the distance between you and the car in front of you. And what we found is that THC decreases your mean speed, decreases the variability, and increases the following distance. Individuals that are under the influence of cannabis tend to know that they might be impaired, and they do try to compensate by reducing speed. When I say that, I also want you to know that in our work with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, when we've studied stops of cannabis-impaired driving, speed was the #1 cause of the stop. So even though we show in this case that it reduces the speed, in actuality, many individuals end up, especially if they have alcohol on board, speeding, and that's the reason for the stop. We know with breath alcohol that the higher the concentration, we also have more significant increases in speed. And there was a significant interaction, and this has also been misinterpreted and misunderstood. So what you see is as the THC concentration increases, you see slower speed and a greater following distance. If you look at alcohol, as the alcohol concentration increases, the speeding increases. And if you look at the two of them together, you will see that it takes a very high concentration of THC to overcome the alcohol. And guess what? I've just told you how rapidly the THC concentration decreases. The concentration immediately peaks during smoking, before the end of smoking, and it drops like a rock in both occasional users and chronic frequent cannabis smokers. So you can see that it can lower the speed, but in reality, the alcohol that's combined with it is much more the dominant factor. Now, is there a correlation between the blood THC concentration and impairment? And this is work we did with the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And we went through their entire exam, the drug recognition expert exams that was discussed by Ms. King just a few minutes ago. Because so many people say, well, that measurement doesn't work for cannabis, it only works for alcohol. So we went through and we found how many of those parameters in their exam are very sensitive to the effects of cannabis. And certainly it has the capability of identifying cannabis. Here's one of the walk and turn. Everybody's probably seen this, someone on the side of the road going through, and through the period of have to follow instructions, have to keep your toe next to your foot, etc. And we found a very good distinct difference between controls with no drug on board and the cannabis only. These are only cannabis, no alcohol. So we saw very robust, significant effects. But guess what? There was no correlation between whether the THC was below 5 nanograms per mil or above 5 nanograms per mil. And because we have a short time today, this is the only one of those examples I'm going to give you. But in every case where we had significant effects, there was no difference between the THC being less or greater than 5 nanograms per mil. Now, one thing that we've published extensively on over the last 6 or 7 years, but the public doesn't know, is you can measure THC in the blood of constant frequent cannabis smokers for up to 33 days after last use. We absolutely know these individuals were in our closed research unit. Well, if it's in the blood, it's definitely in the brain. And we showed that the THC remains in the brain, and this was brought up earlier too. Alcohol is a very water-soluble compound. THC is a very fat-soluble compound, and it is stored in the brain for longer time than you can measure it in blood. So we showed this very long detection period. We also showed objective changes in the brain with downregulation of cannabinoid receptors, and we also showed residual psychomotor impairment that lasted as long as the THC in the brain. Also, what can we do about it? Just a few comments on this. We have identified markers of recent cannabis use, cannabigerol and cannabinol, that if you find it in both an occasional user or a chronic frequent cannabis smoker, it means recent cannabis use. So this is a new tool that you can actually analyze the blood for these minor cannabinoids, and they can tell you, even in a person who has chronic frequent cannabis use, that they've used it very recently. Also, tolerance, we have tremendous misunderstanding of tolerance by the public. They think someone who uses the drug a lot becomes tolerant and has no effects. I think this is one of the two best slides that I have to show you about tolerance. If you look, I don't know if I have a pointer here. Okay. If you look at the far left graph, you will see that when people are sober, someone who is a non-user of cannabis performs better in memory tasks than the individual who's a cannabis user. But when you introduce cannabis, the decrement in memory is going to be steeper in the non-user than the individual who uses. So the take-home message is that tolerance, you have to look at every effect because tolerance is different with every effect, and you have to know that it's never complete. And here's a good example of that from our own work. If you look at the turquoise-colored diagram, that is an occasional cannabis user. Look how high they get at a very low concentration of THC. The chronic frequent user, who's in the dark blue, they want to get the same high from using cannabis. They smoke the drug differently, taking in more drug, holding it in the lungs longer, and they have to have a much higher concentration of THC to reach even close to the same level of high. So tolerance is never complete and it's not overcome. So here's our recommended procedure for documenting cannabis-impaired driving. Number one, you need a trained police officer or other witness who will document that the individual is impaired. That could be a drug recognition expert, it could be an ARIDE trained officer, or it could be an officer who knows how to perform standardized field sobriety tests. You then would use an oral fluid or saliva test to screen at the roadside. We have been doing research and now know that there are some roadside devices that have high sensitivity and specificity and can do this work well. That can be done without an invasive procedure like blood collection. It can be done by an officer who can collect the oral fluid right at the roadside at the time of the event, not an hour or 2 or 3 later. No matter the result of that screening test, you still need to take a confirmation test. If the screening test is positive, you must confirm it in a laboratory with mass spectrometry. But if that screening test is negative, you've already documented the impairment. You still need to take the confirmation test because that will look for a much broader spectrum of drugs. So not only do we have the opioid epidemic with a huge variety of fentanyl analogs and other drugs that will not produce a positive opiate test, but we have psychoactive compounds, the new novel psychoactive compounds, more than 700 new drugs since 2005. So that's very important. And the last thing that I want to say, the public misconceptions that cannabis is not addictive, wrong. That cannabis during pregnancy does not harm the fetus, wrong. That cannabis does not affect cognitive or psychomotor performance, clearly wrong. Cannabis must be safe if it's medicine. Cannabidiol has been proven to prevent seizures in children with Dravet syndrome. Not yet, but there's good hope for that. And tolerance to cannabis effects occurs with chronic frequent use. So there is no single blood drug concentration that reliably distinguishes cannabis impairment in both occasional and chronic frequent cannabis users. However, the public has the right to set a blood or oral fluid THC concentration at which it's unlawful to drive in order to protect public health and safety. Thank you very much.
you, Paul, for organizing this meeting, and my pleasure to share a few thoughts with you about drug driving data. Of course, I am very excited to follow the leadership of, of Heidi King, our Deputy Administrator, who's sincerely enthusiastic about this issue, and I think will be a great help in national leadership in this area. But I don't mind saying I feel a little bit out of place here lecturing to leaders in the field, not only our panel members, but also some of our audience members, Dr. Bob DuPont, our second drug czar and first director of NIDA, Dr. Bertha Madras, former deputy director of ONDCP, among others. So I hope that, and let me also mention Candace Leitner, the founder of Mothers Against Drunk Driving. I hope you agree with my remarks, and if you don't, I hope you point it out kindly. Let me start by mentioning our national roadside survey that we released a couple of years ago. The headline when we released this study was this reversal of alcohol and marijuana, both good news and bad news. The good news was that alcohol had decreased from about 12% to 8% of weekend nighttime drivers. That's any level of alcohol detected in drivers weekend nighttime on the road. That is quite remarkable in a 7-year period, and it's even more remarkable when you consider that's part of a 40-year trend measured by that survey, and it represents an 80% decrease in the proportion of drivers on the road with alcohol in their system. And that same proportional decrease was true for drivers over 0.08. The numbers were smaller, of course, but 80% decrease in 40 years, and that's quite remarkable, and I want to circle back to that point at the end of my comments. But the marijuana increase was as remarkable, and of course, very concerning. Maybe that shouldn't have been surprised because there were other surveys being done, surveys such as SAMHSA's National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which also indicated about a 50% increase proportionally in marijuana use in the public during that period. If we look further at crash data, and I think most of you are aware that the crash data with regard to drugs is not very precise at the current time, but there's lots of it, and if you stand back and look at it, it kind of follows other indicators. Here it indicates also a more than 50% proportional increase in, this is marijuana presence in fatally injured drivers during that time period. So with an accumulation of evidence from various measures of the public indicating a startling rise in marijuana use during this period, it's maybe not surprising that marijuana use became sort of the surrogate for drug-involved driving at the time. That most of the discussion about drugs seemed to be about marijuana. But I want to point out that about half of the prevalence of drugs and driving came from other drugs, not marijuana. So marijuana, according to our roadside survey and our fatal crash data, is the single most prevalent drug other than alcohol, well, actually including alcohol. But about half of the overall presence consists of other drugs, and these are all drugs that can impair driving. That's why we are tracking them. So it is not just a marijuana problem, it's a far wider problem. That distribution, that range of drug types present is also confirmed by the evaluations of these drug recognition experts that Marilyn and Heidi both mentioned. About 30% of the drugs recognized by these drug recognition experts are marijuana. The other 2/3 are other drugs, and again, these are all drugs that can have serious effects on driving. So let me give it a little bit more background on these drug recognition experts, because I think they're going to be a big topic today. This is, at the present time, I think one of our best tools for addressing the drug driving problem. These drug recognition experts are law enforcement officers who, they are sworn officers who are doing traffic patrol duty that receive an extra 100 hours of training. It's a significant amount of training on top of their other law enforcement training. In a structured evaluation process which allows them to document signs and symptoms associated with drug use in one of 7 categories. And this is quite a rigorous process that these evaluations. And because it's rigorous and because it's so well documented, it's quite persuasive in court. And so in court, it is one of sort of 3 areas of evidence that are used to convict drug drivers. So the signs and symptoms are one thing. Of course, they need to get toxicology reports. That's another source. And they need to show some observed driving problem. And so that's, typically that's sort of the way that the case is built in the courtroom. It's the toxicology report, signs and symptoms, and driving behavior together. This is the same set of evidence that is used for convicting a drunk driver with alcohol impairment. But in the case of alcohol, there's an extra sort of benefit on the toxicology area. There's a presumptive level. And so the 0.08 level has been supported by lots of research and behavioral studies. And that really helps in convincing a jury. So if there's a presumptive level and the toxicology report indicates a higher concentration than that presumptive level, well, that kind of takes the pressure off of the other 2 areas, signs and symptoms and driving behavior. For drugs, we don't have the presumptive level for reasons that have already been explained. And because of that, more dependence is placed on evidence of signs and symptoms and driving behavior. And this is why DREs are so important. DREs strengthen the evidence with regard to signs and symptoms. So they are an important tool. We've got 9,400 officers now trained as drug recognition experts. That sounds like a lot, but that's 1% of sworn officers nationwide. 1% are trained, so obviously that's not where we want to be. 2,800 law enforcement agencies, again, sounds pretty good, but you got to keep in mind that there are about 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country, so that's 15%. So we have a ways to go. There's a way to extend their value, and again, a little bit further explanation on a training that's already been mentioned a couple of times. This advanced roadside impaired driving enforcement, the ARIDE training, was developed as a way to better utilize the highly trained drug recognition experts. So those drug recognition experts, they get 100 hours of training. It's quite expensive, and every evaluation takes an hour of their time. So in the enforcement community, that's quite a drain on resources. If we train somebody to be able to do this, we need to utilize them to get a return on investment. And the ARIDE trained officers are a way to funnel cases towards them and utilize that investment to its full extent. So the complete model is There's standardized field sobriety training, which is provided to virtually every sworn officer. That allows him to do alcohol-impaired driving enforcement. On top of that, we would like to have a subset of officers trained with A-ride training. And then on top of that, we'd like to have a smaller group of this most highly trained drug recognition officers. The distribution here, the proportions, I think have to be worked out locally. There isn't a standard formula, and it probably has to do with population density and other factors. But I think states need to determine sort of what the proper proportions are. Clearly 1% is not enough for juries, but I'm not sure what the best number is. I think that has to be worked out. As we work it out, and as we build that drug recognition program, one thing we have to keep in mind is that we're working on a larger system. We're working on the criminal justice system, and that really needs to be our focus, is working on this entire system. The law enforcement officers are just part of that system, so we have to make sure that we're also addressing some of those other components that Heidi mentioned. We've got to make sure that if we have a lot of evaluations being done, that we have tox lab capability to handle those. In some cases now, we have backups of as much as 18 months to get tests back. So we've got to make sure we have trained prosecutors, and we've got to make sure that judges and, in fact, juries are educated as well so they can make informed decisions. So looking forward, with regard to improving drug driving data, there's obviously much to be done. We need better data to identify the problem, to target solutions, to evaluate those solutions. There have been a number of studies on how data can be improved, and in fact, if you look across states, we find a great variance in the testing from state to state. Some states testing as high as 85% of all fatally injured drivers. Some testing very low percentage of fatally injured drivers for any type of drug. Overall, drug testing has come a long way. At this point, about 64%, I think, of fatally injured drivers are tested for some type of drug other than alcohol. That's pretty good, actually, compared to where we were 10 years ago. With regard to alcohol, about 70% of fatally injured drivers are tested for alcohol. So alcohol has another advantage here. For alcohol data, we can fill in the missing data. We can fill in that 30% that we don't have tests for through a statistical method called imputation. We don't yet have that for drugs. So that's one of the gaps we need to address. So overall, I think the studies indicate, studies of state programs to collect drug driving data indicate that states that do a good job for alcohol also tend to do a good job for drugs. And there's room for improvement in virtually every state in terms of laws, laws for mandatory testing, of course, specifically laws that record drug driving offenses and alcohol related driving offenses independently so that we can track them. Policies for reporting that apply to coroners and to medical examiners would help a great deal. Education of all of the stakeholders in this criminal justice system to make sure that they know how important it is to record and to communicate the data from one government office to the next. And of course, resources to pay for not only the testing, but also the equipment and the training that go along with good data collection. On the federal side, obviously there's lots to do, and the fatal crash data are not very precise currently. For the reasons I've mentioned, they are not generalizable because we don't have a way of filling in the unknowns, and we have about 1/3 of fatally injured drivers for which we don't know their drug presence. So we are steadily working on those data. One of the things we're doing is updating the drug list, as Marilyn mentioned. She mentioned 7,000 new drugs. So we constantly need to review the drug list and remove the outdated ones and include newer drugs. We are now reporting both positive and negative findings to make sure that we understand that there was a test and negative finding. We, up until this year, have had a short capability to record drug types. We are only able to fill in 3 drug types on the crash reporting form. Now it's unlimited. We can fill in as many as are detected. And we now include the type of sample taken, blood or oral fluid. We also include whether it's a confirmatory or a screening test, and we indicate where the test results came from, all of which help in stating the problem and doing drug driving research. So I think we're going to take questions later, but let me just close on the alcohol point I made earlier, and this echoes Heidi King's comments. We can do a lot better here. We have done, over the decades, really remarkably well with alcohol. We've by no means solved the problem, but there's been an 80% reduction in the presence of alcohol in drivers. That was not easy. The alcohol problem was complicated. The drug driving problem may be more complicated, but we can do it here. I think we have learned lessons from the alcohol experience. We can apply many of those lessons, but we need to get moving. We need to get some focus. We need priorities, and I'm hoping that the initiative which we are launching will help us gather stakeholders and identify those priorities and maybe get some focus in this area. Thank you very much.
Wow, I see from the agenda, I've got till 11 o'clock. Fantastic. Thank you, Paul, for inviting me to take part in this terrific panel discussion. It's my pleasure to be here, particularly sharing the stage with 2 very close friends and colleagues that we've been working this issue for 10 or more years together. It's a pleasure to be here with Marilyn and Jeff. I also want to acknowledge Bob DuPont for his work in this area. There was a meeting he held, I think about 2011 or perhaps 12, with about 20 of us sitting around the table, and Marilyn and I got into a back and forth discussion, and I was typically a bit more ignorant, and she was telling me that, yes, we can actually test this if I can get some time on the simulator. And I said, well, geez, I could probably pull some money together if that can actually happen. And then Jeff came in to help us get the time at the simulator at Iowa. And that was one of the most rewarding experiences of seeing government work. An idea got sparked in a meeting that Bob held, and that we actually were able to put together a proposal, get it funded, have the cooperation of all 3 federal agencies. It was something, and then you saw the results here briefly that Marilyn presented. Very gratifying project. Many of you may not know what the Office of National Drug Control Policy is, so I'll just start with a brief description of that. We are an office office within the Executive Office of the President. We were formed in 1988 from the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of that year. And our mission is to coordinate drug control policy among all the federal agencies. There's about 16 departments or independent agencies across the federal government that have some role in drug control function, whether it be in supply reduction or demand reduction. And supply reduction includes international programs to suppress drugs in source-producing countries. It's interdiction. It's also domestic law enforcement. Demand reduction is prevention, treatment, and recovery. And among those 16 departments and agencies, there's about 40 bureaus or agencies underneath that. And with the exception of the Drug Enforcement Administration and the National Institute on Drug Abuse, all of those agencies have a multi-mission purpose, so it's not just drugs. And so we try to coordinate that, the efforts between them. And this is just one particular issue that we deal with. I'd also want to acknowledge other partners in this. We've got representatives from NHTSA and formerly NIDA, but we also have the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration is very actively involved. One of the roles that SAMHSA plays is they operate the workplace drug testing program, and they set the standards for drug testing for labs that do that drug testing. And I'll get back to them here in a bit. So we got actively involved in this issue when NHTSA released its 2007 roadside survey results. And that was in December of 2009. Just a little before that, they came over and briefed our director at the time, Gil Kurlikowski, who had just become the director of ONDCP. And Gil has a career in law enforcement, and he was very aware of the carnage on our roads due to alcohol-involved driving. But these results from NHTSA were quite shocking and surprising. This was, Jeff had mentioned that this survey has a pretty long history, but the 2007 was the first time that drugs were added to the survey. And to find that 16.3% of weekend nighttime drivers tested positive for either an illicit drug or a medication that could impair your driving skills was quite surprising. And that spurred him to declare that drug driving was going to be one of the priorities of our national drug control strategy. And that's our primary role, is to prepare this drug strategy, which lays out a blueprint for the nation on how we're going to deal with the drug problem. And so this became one of the priority items, and we set a goal to reduce drug driving by 10% by 2015. And as part of that, we began to work closely with NHTSA to say, what can we do about this? And one of the things that we asked, because we had that goal, we had a baseline with the 2007 survey, but we needed another data point to track and see how well we were doing. And this is a very expensive, complex survey to do. And typically they would do it every 10 years or more. And we asked them to accelerate that timeline so that we could have a measure by 2015. And we provided a bit of funding for it, but NHTSA took the bulk of that. And I'll be forever grateful to them for the effort they put into getting this done. And so that we had the 2013-2014 results by 2015. Unfortunately, however, as Jeff showed, we did not hit that target. In fact, the drug driving got worse. There was some changes in how they did the testing. There were more drugs involved, so they had to do a little adjustment to get a comparable estimate. And that estimate came out to be about 20% of weekend nighttime drivers tested positive for an illicit substance or a medication that can impair. And so that was an increase over that 16.3%. That was very discouraging. And so, as Jeff pointed out, marijuana was accounted for about half of the tests, the positive tests. And that was true in 2007, and it was true in 2013-14. So as we were waiting to get those results, and since then, we've done a number of things to respond to these data. First, we really supported per se laws throughout the states. As Marilyn and Jeff pointed out, we don't have a toxicology test that can tell us the impairment level, the presumptive level for marijuana, or any of the other illicit or medications. As Marilyn pointed out, alcohol is a far less complicated molecule to deal with on this kind of thing. And if you think about the history of setting the 0.08 or the 1.0 levels, that was quite a bit of work just to get the courts to accept those as standards. It just hasn't been possible to do that with drugs, and then it gets even more complicated when you think about the interactions of all the drugs. We do a small study with the University of Maryland called the Community Drug Epidemiology Warning System. And I was just talking to the researchers last week of the current test. What they do is they work with a number of different programs, either the trauma centers, criminal justice settings, drug courts, that all do urine testings. And those samples are saved, and Dr. Eric Wish and his team arranged to get those samples that have been stored, and then they retest them. Most programs like this test for the night of 5. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, PCP, and marijuana. But we now know that there's so many more drugs out there that are being used. And so Eric tests for about 80 to 85 drugs, including synthetic cannabinoids. He finds out what are the most current ones out there. It gets we're working with the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology's drug testing lab. And in this recent example, he was working with a trauma center sample, and they one test came back with 18 different substances in it. And that doesn't mean that person was using all 18 at one time, but within about a 48-hour period, that those would get tested. So polydrug use is a tremendous problem. And so we've been supportive of administrative per se laws, and with the idea that the drugs, including marijuana at the federal level, are illicit, and that the presence of them is prohibited. But we've seen a number of states now that have liberalized their marijuana laws, that have set these levels that Marilyn talked about, and often these levels are just completely inadequate to identify people that are driving under the influence of marijuana. We've also worked to obtain the support of a number of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, primarily among those Mothers Against Drug Driving. I remember talking with Jeff at a previous conference one time, and he made the point, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, that the whole issue around alcohol-involved driving changed when MAD came on the scene. I started my career in 1984 doing contracts for the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And so I know the impact that MAD had on the whole problem of alcohol-involved driving and the significant reductions we've seen. So that's been very gratifying. And then, as I mentioned, we supported the acceleration of the implementation of the next roadside survey. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Richard Compton at NHTSA and his team that designs and implements this survey, an incredibly rich source of information. And then we're also working with SAMHSA. As I mentioned, they do the drug testing for the workplace and set the guidelines and standards for drug testing. At the same time, we were doing the study with Maryland and also working to get the roadside survey done again. We were working with SAMHSA to develop standards for oral fluid testing. The government's testing program up to that point recognized 2 matrices, blood and urine, for drug testing. There's been a lot of pressure to include other matrices, including hair and oral fluids. Back in the mid-2000s, there was an attempt to do this, but the conclusion of the government was that the science wasn't there for either of these. But back in 2011, we looked at it again, and the decision was it looked like oral fluid had advanced sufficiently to be able to do this. We were very supportive of that, provided some funding to SAMHSA to say, let's go ahead with this, because what we wanted to see happen was to get oral fluid recognized as a legitimate matrix in which to test drug use, but to have that then spur the development of a roadside device that could be used by law enforcement because of the problem that Marilyn pointed out so well about the how THC levels go down so quickly once smoking stops. And so we funded them to do this. They've produced these guidelines. They've been going through clearance. They're very close. I think there's some issues yet still about DOT. Transportation has the very large safety drug testing program for safety-sensitive occupations. And there's some issues about how exactly to test for THC, but I think those are going to be resolved soon. Those can get out there. In the meantime, NHTSA hosted a meeting about 3 years ago with industry, law enforcement, us, and some other federal agencies to see what we could do to urge industry to develop these roadside drug testing devices, oral fluid devices. And as Marilyn mentioned, there seems to be some now that meet the sensitivity and specificity requirements. So we're very anxious to see how that works so that we can have a device out there that can help law enforcement. Then I mentioned we supported the simulator study that Marilyn did. Again, a very informative, helpful, cutting-edge project that has provided us with a lot of important information. And then we also have supported the DRE program. As Jeff reviewed, this is a critical program that is underutilized. I remember looking at the data by state, how few cases the DRE are brought in, and very underutilized. And we'd like to see an expansion of that program. And we continue to support NHTSA's request for funding for that. One thing I didn't mention about ONDCP, in addition to setting the policy, we also work with the agencies to establish the budgets, and our director certifies whether those budgets are sufficient to support the strategy. And so we work closely with the agencies to say, you know, how much funding do you need for the various initiatives you're working on? So we support that DRE program. And then a few years ago, again at the same time we were doing this other work, we also provided funding to see if it was possible to develop an online A-RIDE training program. As Jeff mentioned, DRE training is very expensive. It requires officers to go off-site to get this training. A-RIDE is one that can be done a lot shorter time, but it also sometimes involves going outside the department. We thought if we could develop an online internet-based training program, it would be something that would be useful to law enforcement. The officers could take it as part of their daily effort right there at the police stations. So that we worked with the International Association of Chiefs of Police to get that program in place, and it currently exists. And then we also supported international work on drug driving. Bob DuPont reminded me this morning how important it is that the partners internationally that we work with on this. There was a large conference in Oslo, Norway. Let's see, that would have been around 2010, I think. And one night, a group of us went to dinner, and started plotting out having an international symposium on drug driving to bring all the countries that have done a lot of work in this, Europe, Australia, Canada, us, and countries that were anxious to get involved, China, some African countries, Brazil in particular. And we plotted this out, and I went back and got some funding approved. And we had the first international symposium in 2011 in Montreal. And that's been followed up with one in Wellington, New Zealand, and then one in Lisbon last year. And so I'm hoping that that will continue. This issue continues to be a focus for federal drug control policy. As Administrator King mentioned, NHTSA continues to do a lot of work in this area. Next month is going to be the event that she mentioned, and we look forward to that. It's going to continue to be a focus within the National Drug Control Strategy. There is funding in the 2019 fiscal year 2019 budget to support this continuing efforts, and I look forward to continue working on this with many of you and my colleagues on stage here as well. So thank you.
Marilyn and Jeff, you have anything you want to add to the comments Terry just made, or anything you want to comment on it? Go right ahead.
Okay. So, you've heard about the FARS program and how much NHTSA is working on improving that. But we have a big problem in that many states, if the alcohol is above 0.08, they don't even look for drugs. So this has really skewed all of our knowledge about drug-impaired driving, and we need to change that. There was also mention about the legal. In many states, it's the same charge whether you have alcohol and drugs. So many prosecutors see no value in prosecuting the case for drugs. But another point that we didn't bring up was the National Safety Council, and we've met every few years, and NHTSA also helps support that initially. And we actually are trying to get toxicology laboratories at state and local level that do all the toxicology to have the equipment and the instrumentation and the knowledge, the personnel to be able to do the testing. Because you heard about backlogs, but many labs don't have the equipment you need, and therefore also say, well, let's just do alcohol and stop there. So we have a group, and we have surveyed all of the laboratories in the U.S., and we have continually raised the bar on what is necessary to test for drug driving. And we have set what the laboratory needs to be able to do. And every year we're surveying the labs to see, are they making this? Are they using it to improve their service? And one of the very nice things is this document can now be taken by those laboratory personnel to their bosses and say, look, this is what I need to be able to do in order to do drug driving cases. So we have just published that again this year, again with more uniform support, but also we've added oral fluid testing in and cut off concentrations for oral fluid as well.
Jeff?
Thank you. I would just like to add just a bit of further focus on the central role of the criminal justice system here. Really, I think a case could be made that our success in dealing with alcohol-impaired driving has really revolved around the courtroom. That is, we created a set of laws that could be acted upon. We created some education for law enforcement to allow them to be effective. We educated the public about the role of alcohol in crashes, and that was reflected in jury decisions. And so I think using that model, we have to think the same way with drug driving. We have to sort of think from the courtroom out, and that involves a lot of effort. That involves, not only laws and law enforcement and effective prosecution and tools to present cases, such as including DREs, but it also involves this education component as well. Looking back at our alcohol success, I don't want to imply that we've solved that problem, but we have made tremendous inroads. And getting back to Terry's comment about the importance of MAD, during this period of from 1980 to the mid-1990s, that's when we made our progress in alcohol-impaired driving. During that period, we did an analysis at NHTSA some years ago. We identified 5 core drunk driving laws. So each state needed 5 core drunk driving laws. During that period, so five per state, 51 with the district. So 255 possibilities. During that period, 245 of those 255 laws were passed. And they got passed because of advocacy in every state, and that was done largely by MAD volunteers. And so that's the kind of change that we need is, we're going to need, some focus, and we're going to need, a finite set of things to concentrate on, and we're going to need widespread activism to get it done. So that's my wisdom.
Before we take questions from the audience, I have a couple I'd like to ask. In the reading I've done, some advocates for the liberalization of the marijuana laws have said that driving under the influence of marijuana will not be a major problem because of compensatory behaviors that drivers can engage in. For example, as it was pointed out, they may drive more slowly. They may not pass other cars. They may keep more distance between themselves and others. The compensatory behavior, however, doesn't deal with the emerging problems that happen when you're driving. You can try to keep distance between the car in front of you, but you can't deal with the problem of someone who cuts you off. My understanding is that various drugs, including marijuana, will reduce the reaction time that drivers have. Is there any way to compensate for that problem? In other words, the argument that they're making about compensatory behavior, does it apply in the case of reaction time?
So the biggest problem I see with cannabis-impaired driving is with executive function. So this is key. So you take an executive function as taking all the information in from your environment, comparing it to your knowledge, your memory, evaluating that data, deciding on a course of action, and following through. And the problem with cannabis is it tremendously affects anything that's unexpected. So the ability to react. So I'll tell you this is a true case. A young man driving down a street, he's going slower. He's been using marijuana. He has friends in the car. He's going slowly. And he looks way down the street and he sees an old man crossing the street. And he calculates in his head, as we all do, well, how fast am I going? And okay, he's going to be out of the way, no problem. But the old man drops his keys and it's really hard for him to bend over and he's fumbling and he can't get it. So the reaction time is key. So the young man sees that this has happened. But the time it takes to take it in, what should I do? Should I swerve to the left? Should I slam on my brakes? And actually responding to that change is much delayed. All of the processes, if it's a child coming out on a bicycle out of the side road, cannabis will reduce a small amount your peripheral vision. So number one, they may see it a little bit later. But then the time it takes to evaluate it and make a decision and enact that decision is where cannabis really has its effects. That and then that weaving in the road that I showed you, it's almost an autonomic function that we do, and we know we have good evidence that they can't compensate for that and don't compensate for that. It's true that in studies like ours where we have limitations on the amount of drug that we give someone, we clearly saw within individual that they slowed down and they kept a larger distance. Sometimes that's bad. One of the big things that happens is somebody sitting impaired on cannabis at the red light and the light changes and they don't move. Okay, so that it can also be a problem. But I think the key problem is the executive function and inability to respond to unexpected events.
Anyone like to add to that?
No, I mean, I think you covered that well. I would only say that from what I've read about preliminary data from Colorado is that law enforcement there is seeing an increase in cannabis-involved traffic accidents. So, crashes, yes, exactly. Thank you.
And Washington State as well. Washington State showed a 25% increase in cannabis-impaired driving arrests within 6 weeks of the legal cannabis, and they already had medical cannabis in place.
Two of the drugs that were mentioned today are opiates and cannabis, and the problems they can create for driving. But they create different types of problems, not just from a biochemical perspective, but from a policy or political perspective. With respect to opiates, they are the subject of the concern of the massive number of overdoses we've seen. Does the presence of that concern essentially suck all the oxygen out of the room with respect to the question of opiate-induced impaired driving? With respect to marijuana, it's a different sort of problem. The problem is you have a large number of states that seem to be going along with a liberalization program without addressing this issue at all. They don't seem to have really debated it, I think, in the way it should have been, but also it seems to have been pushed as, in essence, no harm, no foul. It's only going to be something that individuals do. They're not going to harm anybody else. How do we deal with those two very different? Well, first of all, if you disagree with the way I've characterized them, please, say why I'm wrong. But if you agree, how do we deal with that? We got two very different type of responses I think we need to that. Jeff, Terry, Marilyn, anyone? This is an old GE, college ball toss-up.
Yeah, okay. That's a large question.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think the simplest answer to that is through education. These are two very different problems. There is a genuine therapeutic need for pain relief, and that's a societal benefit, and we need to address that need, and we need to prevent impairment resulting from that therapy from appearing on the roadway. So that's, I think, primarily an educational problem. The physicians who are prescribing those medications, the pharmacists who are distributing those medications, the patients who are ingesting those medications need to understand the potential for impairment and their responsibility to separate driving from periods of impairment. So for opioids, I think the answer is an education. For the marijuana problem, there seems to be a widespread need for education. There seems to be a misunderstanding about the potential for marijuana to impair driving, and we need to clarify that. It's not an easy thing to study. We're going to have to get better at studying it. In the meantime, we need to get better at talking about it.
And I would add, it's a good question, and I agree with Jeff, it's very complicated. I think two different, there's such distinctive things here. With opioids, you have both illicit ones with the medication, which, as Jeff said, there's benefits to them, but they've been overprescribed. They've been used. We're now realizing that they're not indicated for all types of pain. And you have different kinds of opioid medications that have specific indications. The big thing in the last 2 years has been fentanyl, a synthetic opioid, which should only be used for cases of acute severe pain. And that's being manufactured illicitly. It's coming in through the mails directly from China. It's also being made illicitly in Mexico. And then you have heroin. And in these cases, there's no statewide movements to liberalize laws to allow more use of these kinds of opioids. And I think, as you mentioned at the beginning of your question, Paul, the issue for opioids is overdose deaths. There were 63,000 drug overdose deaths last year, or 2016, I should say, and 2/3 of those involved an opioid, either an illicit opioid like heroin or opioid medications. And for the past 10 or 12 years, these have been driven by the misuse of opioid medications. But in 2016, there were as many deaths involving opioid medications as there were fentanyl. And both of those are greater than heroin deaths. So this is a changing dynamic with these opioids. And the other thing about it, too, is this represents the lower end of the limit. We know that many other cases occur that don't get detected. The medical examiners are just overwhelmed with these cases. Some jurisdictions are doing at least one or more autopsies a day. And it's just, they just can't investigate all the suspicious deaths. So we know it's an undercount. So in one respect, it's the problems identified as different, and so the responses are different. But I think it's important to also understand the impact of opioids on drug driving as well. The data that Jeff showed, I hadn't seen that chart before, Jeff, on the DRE cases, how many of them involved opioids, because as I recall from the roadside surveys, the opioids detected were fairly small, relatively small. So I found that quite interesting.
Yes, so I think we have a huge problem with pain, and we want to treat people appropriately, but it has become such a nightmare as far as the overdoses. So we have a problem also for treatment of opioid dependence. We use opioids, we use buprenorphine and methadone, and that's been an issue for a long time too. That, in fact, there's some pretty good data saying that just like being on an anti-epileptic reduces problems with driving, being on methadone does not impair your driving if you're taking it according to the prescription. So we have both the protecting the individuals that need the pain medication, protecting individuals that are going through opioid treatment, which is what we want, and not to affect them. I think we have the overdose situation is unbelievable with the numbers. And when you talk about not being able to identify it, many times it's the brand new fentanyl analogs, and we don't have tests to be able to identify that. As far as the cannabis, I think I hear this argument all the time, well, isn't marijuana better than alcohol? And the point is that cannabis approximately doubles the risk of a major accident or fatality. So it's not, alcohol can increase up to 30 times your risk or even higher. But that's not an answer. Why do you want to allow a doubling of the risk and increasing the injuries? I went to Canada 3 times to talk to them about cannabis. When you say we're really not prepared, that's absolutely true. We're passing laws and legalizing it, and I've been to the Vermont legislature and the Maine legislature, and they're not prepared at all. They passed the law, but they haven't put in place what they're going to do about traffic safety. One aspect that Canada did that I think was very important in their new laws, they have the 5 nanogram per mil, which is way too high a cutoff because the occasional users of cannabis are going to be below 5 nanograms per mil in less than an hour and a half, and they're going to be impaired for far beyond that time frame. They did add in if there's cannabis with any amount of alcohol. So they recognize the interaction between the two and said if there's any alcohol and cannabis together, that's an offense, that's assumed an illegal driving. So that's one thing that many states in our country can think about.
The 3 of you have mentioned education. Education of physicians, education of pharmacists, education of policymakers, and education to the general public. What, and you all 3 have or still do work for the federal government. What can the federal government do in this regard? We had a series of TV ads years ago, the famous "This is your brain on drugs." How effective were they? How effective is federally directed education? Or is it something that really has to happen at the community level by community leaders who people in neighborhoods know and will trust? What education do we need to do, and what can the federal government, if anything, do to help that along? And this is a toss-up again for all of you.
Just a short comment. So I find that a very critical question because if you look at Australia, Australia started oral fluid drug testing at the roadside with random stops, which we don't allow at all, in 2004. But whatever they did, they convinced the public to support it completely. There was no outcry about our rights, and it was all put out as, we have a problem with drugged driving. We have to fix it. Your mother, your child, your brother could die from this. We're going to start doing this to reduce drug-impaired driving. And they got the public behind them that it's worked very effectively to help them reduce that. And I think we're so resistant. I know there's a big movement to lower the alcohol from 0.08 to 0.05. And there's tremendous resistance here about that, where, as I said, in Scandinavia, they have 0.02. In most of the world, it's 0.05. So we're a society that accepts and allows more risk than other societies.
Thank you. I think the federal government certainly has a role here, but this education, this messaging has to come from all directions, I think. And it needs to be clear, and it needs some focus. I think our Deputy Administrator, Heidi King, has correctly recognized the need to bring the stakeholders together and talk about priorities in messaging and try to add some focus so that we're all saying the most important thing and saying it in similar terms so that it is clear and convincing.
Terry? And the education, I think, is critical, and there's various aspects of it. As I think, Paul, you were suggesting, when you look at practitioners, there was a study done several years ago that surveyed all the medical schools in North America, and it found that on average, med students got about 11 hours in in their studies on pain management and administration of opioids. And so the federal government has very little control or influence on medical education and the practice of medicine. That's done at the state level. But we did work with medical colleges to ask them to add addiction medicine to the curriculum. And we've seen an adoption of that in quite a few of the medical schools, and also asked them to consider funding fellowships for addiction medicine, and a number of them have been doing that. We also have been asking that there be continuing medical education for practitioners to learn more about when and how to prescribe for opioids. And we've got all of the federal practitioners within the Department of Health and Human Services, veterans. We're working with DOD to all of them to adopt some kind of CME for their medical people. And then you have the general public. The Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration has their National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And they have some questions on there that ask, the last time you used a pain reliever, where did you get it? And somewhere around 60% of them got it from a friend or a relative out of the medicine cabinet, essentially. And so there's been a lot of education going on to try to tell people you need to make sure that your medicines are secure. We've done, along with DEA and the rest of the government, national take-back days to say, don't keep your unneeded medications at home. Police will tell you the 3 most commonly stolen things from your house when you're burglarized are guns, money, and drugs. And I've heard people, real estate agents, talking about how people will come in during an open house, and one person will distract the real estate agent while the other makes an excuse to go to the bathroom, and they go through the medicine cabinet. So you've got to secure the drugs. So we've been emphasizing that. And you mentioned the broader media campaign type thing. The Partnership for Drug-Free America had done the egg on drugs kind of commercial that was done during Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. And then in 1998, ONDCP sponsored the National Youth Anti-Drug Media Campaign that ran for about a dozen years. And now the FY 2019 budget includes funding for another public messaging campaign that the President's Special Advisor, Kellyanne Conway, is spearheading. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how that's going to be implemented and what that message is going to be. But so there's various audiences and messages that need to be implemented, and the government plays a varying role in those.
I'd now like to offer the audience a chance to ask questions. Yeah, please just state your name, who, if anyone, you represent, ask a question, and keep it relatively short. So I know the first one to speak will be the well-known Candace Leitner.
I'm Candace Leitner, representing We Save Lives. So first, I just have to make a quick comment on education. We find if we post anything, because we've been dealing with this issue for 5 years, on drug driving, dealing with government funded studies, that we get such a backlash from the marijuana community. But I will tell you what they do listen to. When we get people who do use marijuana but don't drive, and they post that, and also DREs who talk about their personal experiences in terms of arresting drug drivers, amazingly enough, they'll tend to back off on some of their comments. But Jeff, I wanted to ask you, because you brought this up, and I'm hoping this will be addressed on March 15th. the medical community, although they do a poor job of educating people about opioid use in terms of driving, they don't do as much as they should, and the same is true of the pharmacists, but still you can read the information inside the box that does give you warnings. Let me ask a really dumb question. I've never seen marijuana prescribed. I don't know anything about how it's done or if it's done or how they work it, but is there any warnings that come with that? If doctors prescribe it or people sell it in clinics or whatever, are there any warnings that come with that say be careful about driving? Anything like that at all?
No, it's not prescribed, it's recommended.
Yeah, it's recommended, not prescribed. There's,
Well,
yes.
whatever, recommended, handed out, however they do it, and I don't know because I've never done it. Don't need to, but when they hand it out or how recommended, do they say anything? Do doctors do this? Do they say anything? But they would if it was an opioid or some other drug, correct? Or how? Tell me what the difference is. And are you going to address that March 15th? Heidi? She's still here. Are we getting the medical community there to talk about this issue?
My understanding is that marijuana is illegal in the United States, but I realize that states have taken different policies. We would like to speak about impairment and the challenges and the opportunities, but I'll say this was not a question. I'll say collecting the questions is a key part of that. So to the extent that we use that opportunity to harvest the questions that we need to be addressing, yes. Whether or not we have the answer that day, that would be great, but that's ambitious.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for raising it.
I would only add too, that I think that there's over half the states have some type of medical, so-called medical marijuana laws, and the range of variability of how those schemes are put into place is about as many as there are states. And so, I can't definitively answer your question because I don't know what's done in each of those states, but I suspect that there's very little warning about the impairment ability of the marijuana for driving when they recommend the marijuana.
Sir, right there.
Hi, Jake Nelson, AAA National Office here in Washington, D.C. My question is for you, Marilyn. So I'd say within the last 18 months, NIDA did a public survey of the research community relative to its use of marijuana, among other things, and for research purposes. And I think among the top 3 pieces of feedback that NIDA got, which is posted on their website, is related to the THC concentration used in the strain of marijuana permitted or used in research by NIDA or by the federal government, and whether or not it should be more reflective of what is available through dispensaries. And I've heard conflicting reports about, so on its face, it makes sense that it should be comparable. But I've also heard from some research, a minority of them, that that's not necessarily a need. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so the NIDA, and I've been gone 2 years, but I know about this one for sure. So NIDA has there's one approved location that can grow the cannabis. And to be honest, support for that program was not forthcoming over the last several years. It's certainly picked up now with the legalization. The interesting thing, you hear that all the time. It's not what we do with our research is not applicable because it's low. So I'm so glad you asked that question because people titrate their dose. We've shown that over and over and over again. So if you give a person a lower potency, they're going to smoke it to the level of their comfort. And the first thing that happens is your heart starts beating. And people are very sensitive to that. Immediately also the psychological effects. If you give that person a much more potent cannabis cigarette, they smoke it differently. So they're going to end up pretty close to the same level where they're comfortable. And in one of my very first studies, we actually used a computerized smoking thing. We didn't let people ad lib smoke. We had the number of puffs, the length of the inhalation, the whole time, everything but the depth of inhalation, which is really almost impossible to control. And it was so interesting, the variability that was there when we did it that way. And the person with the lowest THC concentration had the highest heart rate increase, so that they are not comfortable with that. Now, I have shown this and published it and say it, but I have to put a caveat now. We know nothing about e-cigarettes that are used to smoke. We know nothing about dabbing, the really high concentration extracts that people are smoking. When you watch YouTube to see it, it shocks me. I mean, a person, their first dab, and they light it with a torch and they take it all in, 80 to 90% THC in one breath. They immediately fall on the ground, they seize, they vomit, they roll over. I mean, it's frightening. And they get up and say it was best experience they ever had. I mean, so we have a real problem. And we don't know if you can titrate if you dab. We don't know, does the e-cigarette allow you to titrate? So in general, it wasn't a problem before with these new things. In my studies with lower potency, I have higher concentrations than you'll see reported anywhere, okay? But now we have all these new forms and we don't know enough about them. And also for NIDA now has at this farm a major impetus to increase THC. They now have up to 15 or more percent, and also varying with Dr. Madras sitting next to you, varying concentrations of cannabidiol. So before the cannabidiol was low, now they have products that have both THC and CBD.
So I'm hearing is for smoked marijuana, it's less of an issue because of titration, but for edibles and any of the other forms of ingested, doesn't help us.
Correct.
Bertha, I think you had your hand up. Do you have a question? If you don't, I don't want to put you on the spot.
No. I was wondering what leverage the federal government has with regard to standardizing highway testing. If they support the construction of highways, why isn't there leverage there with regard to having standardized array of testing?
So I think that the federal government can certainly play a role with guidance in this area. In terms of actual mandates, I'm not so sure, but I think there's a need here for guidance to help standardize priorities for testing and perhaps threshold levels and maybe even testing methods.
I think the problem is that the labs are primarily state and local labs, and they're very poorly funded. And mandates, although they'd be tremendously welcomed by the labs themselves, you know, they need the money to support the testing, and that's not coming from the federal government.
Well, gang, I promised you at the outset you would hear from 3 experts. I hope you believe I delivered, because I sure do. I think we owe a great debt of gratitude to each of our experts. I want to thank them both on behalf of Heritage and myself. I appreciate this. If private parties can do anything to help with the education process, I know that this did. Thank you very much. Gang, I think we're going to get started on round 2. You heard about the problem, and now you're going to hear some solutions. The people you're going to hear from are as expert in his or her own area as the people you first heard from today. The first speaker is Mr. Jacob Nelson. He is the Director of Traffic Safety Advocacy and Research for the Automobile Association of America, commonly known as AAA. As a trained epidemiologist and as the AAA safety expert, Mr. Nelson provides insight and analysis on all issues relating to traffic safety for the media and the general public. He views motor vehicle crashes as an overlooked public health threat. He has developed strategies to educate drivers, families, policymakers, and the media on AAA safety initiatives in an effort to protect the public generally, but in particular the most vulnerable people, small children, teens, and older drivers. He works regularly with transportation policy stakeholders, public health practitioners, and elected officials. He frequently represents AAA before state policy audiences, Congress, and U.S. federal agencies. He has been featured in national media outlets, including the New York Times, and has often spoken on substance-impaired driving. The next person will be Dr. Kevin Sabat. Dr. Sabat is a graduate of Oxford University and Berkeley College, an author and an assistant professor. Dr. Sabat has studied drug policy for 20 years. He was a drug policy advisor in 3 different Democratic and Republican presidential administrations, including the Obama administration, where he was a senior advisor in the Office of National Drug Control Policy. In 2013, he published the book Reefer Sanity, 7 Great Myths About Marijuana. And the second edition of that book is due to be released in the spring of this year. Along with former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, Dr. Sabat is a co-founder and president of Smart Approaches to Marijuana, a national organization working exclusively on smart marijuana policy issues. Then you will hear from Candace Leitner. She asked a question during the first part of this presentation, so you may have heard her voice. Now you will get to see her. Ms. Leitner was the founder of Mothers Against Drug Driving. Is the founder of Mothers Against Drug Driving, a nationally and internationally recognized organization that was a moving force behind reshaping the nation's attitude towards drunk driving. She has testified before Congress, state houses, committees, and has formed coalitions such as SOS for Save Our Students as powerful political tools. Ms. Leitner has been involved in the passage of numerous bills at the state and national levels, including legislation that raised the drinking age to 21, a move that is properly credited with saving thousands of lives. In 2013, Ms. Leitner founded We Save Lives as a representative voice on highway safety issues. We Save Lives is focused on drunk, drugged, and distracted driving. The organization works with more than 60 partners at the local, state, national, and international levels to reduce deaths and injuries on highways. She has received numerous awards and has appeared in numerous media outlets to try to protect lives against the carnage that happens from drunk and drugged driving. Finally, we have Dana Stevens. Dana has 20-plus years of experience in this field. She is the grassroots coordinator for the Driving Means High DUI initiative that was set up by SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana. She is also the executive director at Community Action, Service, and Advocacy, or CASA, a San Diego County agency that helps residents avoid substance abuse. She therefore helps them not simply to avoid driving under the influence of various intoxicants, but to avoid becoming addicted or using them at all. Ms. Stevens has managed several federally funded programs, including several ONDCP drug-free communities grants and a Sober Truth on Preventing Underage Drinking, or STOP Act grant. Please join me in welcoming these experts so that you can hear about some solutions to the problems we know from drunk and drug driving. Thank you. Jake?
All right. So my talk will be a little bit easier than planned because I had Marilyn here to cover some of the content, which is helpful. So you don't have to look farther than the national media headlines to see that there's a lot of misinformation out there on marijuana in particular as it relates to driver safety. And Marilyn listed a long list of some of the most common misconceptions about that topic. So then we shouldn't be surprised that public support for legalization of marijuana has grown and that the perspective that it should remain illegal has sort of waned over the years. And we've done our own research too at the AAA Foundation to look at what the public believes about drugged driving in general. And what's really interesting is if you look at sort of the proportion of people, this is a national survey, the proportion of drivers who believe that drug driving is a threat is 60% as compared to 69% for alcohol, who believe that drug driving is a bigger problem today than it was 3 years ago, 59% versus 49% for alcohol, which is interesting. So people do believe that it's a growing problem, but they generally also believe that it's not as bad as alcohol. So what proportion of folks believe that it's unacceptable to drive after using marijuana? 89%, 97% say the same for alcohol. So interesting sort of way that the numbers run out there on how the public views alcohol versus marijuana, despite believing that drug driving is a growing problem in our country. So like a lot of people in the United States, we at AAA wanted to understand a little bit better what the fatal crash statistics, how they would change, what they would tell us in a state that had legalized marijuana for recreational use. And so we looked at which states had data systems that were adequate to try to get as close to the answer to this question as possible, and Washington State was our candidate. And so what we did was look at the crash data both before and after their law to legalize recreational marijuana took effect, and what we found was that the proportion of drivers involved in fatal crashes who had recently used marijuana more than doubled from before to after their law took effect. This doesn't mean that more than double the number of people died in crashes because of marijuana. It just means that marijuana was a growing contributing factor to those crashes. And this is something that I think other states who've chosen to legalize for recreational use could expect to see as well. Probably the more common thing that we see across the country is that policymakers at the state level in particular, wanting to do the right thing to try to manage the highway safety implications of these measures, want to establish a per se limit for marijuana, just like we have for alcohol. And Marilyn, you've covered a lot of this already, so I don't have to go into detail. We did a study, very similar to one, in fact, that Marilyn did, that looked at DRE data. So the assessment data that DREs are, and I think about 11 or 12 states had provided on arrests and convictions relative to cannabis-impaired drivers. And we essentially found no relationship between sort of the amount of active THC in a driver's system and the likelihood that they would be convicted of impaired driving, and thus there is no sort of underpinning from a research standpoint for the establishment of a particular per se limit for cannabis. Now, I agree with Marilyn that the public has a right to establish these limits, but they're not going to be based on science, at least in terms in the way of cannabis or THC. So what do we do as an alternative? So at AAA, we believe that you ought to have real evidence of the crime. Novel concept, right? And Jeff Michael talked a little bit about this in his talk. So the signs and symptoms of impairment and driver behavior. So ideally, what gets you pulled over in the first place as a suspected impaired driver, the results of a standard field sobriety test, and if possible, the opinion of a drug recognition expert. Now, a lot of law enforcement across this country say that they like per se limits for cases. But if you talk to a DRE versus a traditional patrol officer, they will tell you something very different. They will say if your case depends on the result of a toxicology lab test, you've already lost your case. So a DRE will say, we don't want per se limits. Your traditional law enforcement officer will say it makes our job easier because it's black and white. So it's important to consider that in the context of this discussion at the state level when the debate is being had. So we have, over the last few years, been lobbying the states who have considered legalizing marijuana for recreational or medical use to not establish per se limits for them, but instead to move in the direction of a permissible inference law, similar to what's outlined here. So if you have the actual evidence of the crime of impaired driving, and you can confirm that there's a drug in the blood or in a body fluid of the person who's committed this crime that could be responsible for that impairment, then the jury can use the tool of permissible inference in their judgment. So that is the recommendation that we make as an alternative to a traditional per se limit. So when I began, I mentioned that there's a lot of misinformation out in the media and among policymakers relative to cannabis and driving and drug driving in general. And these are some of the most common reasons why. And in my question to Marilyn before on the previous panel, I alluded to this whole issue of federal versus street marijuana. And so we had a little light shined on that for us, which is very helpful. Some other examples would be internal validity of early studies. So folks like Marilyn who've studied this for a very long time, in the very beginning, didn't really understand that it was active THC that was the psychoactive component of marijuana. And so they were looking for inactive metabolites of the drug in the bodies of drivers and trying to correlate those metabolites to driver impairment or crash risk. Do you think that they found a relationship? Absolutely not. But the pro-marijuana lobby is really smart, and they're aware that these studies exist. And to your average local policymaker, if you put a ream of studies published in peer-reviewed journals that say that there's no relationship between using marijuana and driving, they will believe it because, well, it's in these journals. And so they selectively pull studies from the early days to help make that case. But if you are not a good steward of science and research in that way and look for that type of information, so when I grab their fact sheets while at these state hearings and I look at the dates of some of these studies, I know exactly what they're doing. And so it's up to us, people who are stakeholders in this issue, to be better stewards in that way and to educate policymakers about what science should be used and what shouldn't be used in making it their judgment on a particular policy, whether it's legalization for recreational or medicinal or the establishment of per se or whatever. Another good example would be drug testing for drivers in fatal crashes. And so Jeff Michael mentioned this in his talk, that in some states, it's around 2%, the proportion of drivers involved in fatal crashes who are tested for drugs. And in other states, it's over 85%. Well, it's these data that are rolled up nationally to help us understand the magnitude and scope of this problem. But if you imagine those states who have 2, 3, 4, 5% of their drivers involved in fatal crashes suddenly started testing over 85%, do you think that what we understand the problem to be in that state could be wildly different from what we understand it today? Absolutely it could. And if that were to happen over a greater proportion of states, the data rolled up nationally might paint a very different picture about drug-impaired driving in this country. So that's a big problem. And then another that I'll share is DUI arrest and conviction data. And so when somebody is arrested for impaired driving, or if they're convicted of impaired driving, that's their crime, is impaired driving. Sometimes we'll know that it was DUI drugs, or DUI alcohol, and sometimes it's both, but almost always we're completely in the dark on when we look to those data to understand, well, how many people in a particular state were arrested for DUI alcohol only versus DUI drugs only, and what were those drugs? And then what proportion of them mix alcohol and drugs together? That is not generally known in any state in this country without really working hard to find the answer to it. And that's a problem that we face in terms of understanding the magnitude and scope of this problem. So the last item on this list here, peak THC blood level versus peak impairment. This is a very crude picture to illustrate a very simple point, is that for all of the policymakers in this country trying to do the right thing at the state level to establish a per se limit for drugs, we'll just use cannabis as one example because it's the cool kid in class right now, that if the solid line is the concentration of active THC in blood, and the dashed line is that concentration of active THC in the fatty tissues of the brain, and peak impairment for most people is assumed to be here when the concentration of active THC is highest in blood, hence why people want to measure THC in blood as an indicator of impairment. But actually, peak impairment occurs here when the amount of active THC in the fatty tissues of the brain reaches its peak. And at the roadside, are we ever going to record the concentration of active THC in the fatty tissues of our brain? I certainly hope not. So why in the world do we try to measure active THC in blood and think that in some way, some shape, somehow it's going to tell us something about driver impairment? It never will. Until we understand the relationship between how much THC is in our blood is related to the odds that we will then cause a traffic crash. And I don't think that we'll see that in my lifetime. So that's a challenge that we face. So here's where things sit today in terms of legalization for recreational and medicinal use, and where you see those red pens dropped in is where there's some version of a per se standard set for cannabis. There are 17 states in 2018 that have bills introduced to legalize marijuana for recreational use using a bill versus a ballot measure. And that's very different than where we were just 2 years ago. So this problem isn't going away, it's only gonna become more complicated. And to make matters worse, it's not just cannabis, it's drugs other than cannabis too, prescribed drugs in particular. And the US represents only 5% of the world's population, but we consume 75% of all prescribed medications. We like our pills here in the US. In fact, we don't like to go to the physician if we're not feeling well, unless we're going to leave with a prescription for something, even if we don't really need it, because in our head, it makes us feel better, right? Well, this contributes to the problem of overprescribing and how people become addicted to prescribed medications. 6.4 million people in the last 30 days admitted willingly to using a prescribed medication for non-medical purposes. They're abusing prescribed drugs. The AAA Foundation a few years ago developed a tool called Roadwise RX, and it's basically automating a brown bag exercise. So if you see a healthcare provider, this is generally something that older adults would do with their primary care provider or their gerontologist. And so you would bring all the prescribed and over-the-counter drugs that you take regularly in a bag to your provider appointment, and they'll go over those drugs with you to understand if there are any drugs that could be impairing your driving or interacting with each other to affect your health or your care. This automates that process. So you can use that window there to enter in each drug that you take and submit it, and it will produce a report to you that looks like that, but normal size screen, that will flag all the potential impairments that the drugs that you take used in isolation or in combination could impair your driving, and how specifically that impairment could occur. Does it affect your vision, your reaction time? Does it make you sleep behind the wheel? That kind of thing. You can print out that report, take it to your pharmacist or your local healthcare provider to understand what can be done to help mitigate the conflict between the drugs you have to take and your need to drive. And there are some things that can be done in that lane. But drug overdose now kills more people than traffic crashes, and that's something that we've not seen in this country for a very long time. And over half of those, as you heard earlier from Terry, are prescribed opioid pain medications. And so we're not even counting this guy, heroin. Now, of course, over 90% of people who are addicted to heroin in the United States began or initiated their addiction by using prescribed opioid pain medications. So these things are related, even though the image that we might have in our head about heroin users might not be the same image that we would have in our heads about somebody who's addicted to a pain medication that they received because of an injury. But very much these end up being one and the same person. So this map is old, but all that really is important for you to pay attention here is that the purple states, the dark purple states, are states where there are more prescriptions for opioid pain medications than there are people who live there. And we already consume over 75% of all prescribed medications on the globe. So this is part of the problem, is prescribing of these medications beyond the way that they should be prescribed for medical purposes. The good news is that there are ways to respond. This is the heroin epidemic, but it's the opioid epidemic generally. So we can prevent people from starting or becoming addicted to heroin or opioids by looking at prescribing guidelines, and I'll share with you more on that in a moment. Also, we can look at prescription drug monitoring programs, which are pretty effective as well. We can reduce addiction to opioids by substance abuse treatment. This is historically underfunded in this country, and so if the federal government is serious about doing something to help reduce addiction, we could beef up funding in this direction. And then there's reversing overdose through naloxone. And so making sure that law enforcement officers have a supply of this drug and are trained to administer it while on duty is a really important countermeasure to helping save lives of people who overdose when they're behind the wheel of their car. So the CDC, working with the National Safety Council, a few years ago put out some prescribing guidelines for healthcare providers relative to opioid pain medications. And so these are just guidelines. They have no teeth. And a lot of healthcare providers and healthcare provider organizations would love to be able to comply with these recommendations, but there are forces at play beyond their control through health insurance providers and other things that make abiding by these recommendations easy to do. And I won't go into those now, but something that would be important to look into. In the state of Florida, there was a CDC study that looked at a reduction in opioid overdose deaths as a result of their drug monitoring program and their pill mill law. So another indication that with the right policies in place, that there is hope to help reduce the number of people who overdose on opioids. One of the least sexy things that need to be done, and probably the single most important thing that needs to be done, is to improve data relative to drugged and drug-impaired driving. And I can't think of anything more appropriate for the federal government than dealing with the data issues that we have. This is a report that is available on the foundation, the AAA Foundation's website, that lists 19 different recommendations for the federal government and for state governments to improve their data systems relative to drug driving. And so these are opportunities to move in the right direction there. And we cannot, even if we can develop really good, promising approaches, whether it's a policy or a program or whatever, and understand the impact that it's having, if we don't have the data that we would need to evaluate that and to conduct that research. And so getting the data that we need to not only understand the problem the way that we should understand it, but to evaluate the problem and the countermeasures that we develop to address it. We need better data, and it's probably the single most important thing we can do in that way. The AAA Foundation has a variety of research projects related to drug driving in progress, more than I've listed here. But one of the projects that we're doing is looking at some of the known and trusted countermeasures relative to alcohol-impaired driving and mitigating that problem, and looking at how, if applied a little bit differently, could we use those same countermeasures to identify the drugged driver. And so a good example might be a sobriety checkpoint. So when are sobriety checkpoints most commonly scheduled? Evenings and weekends, because that's when we know alcohol-impaired drivers are most commonly on the road. Well, if the DRE data from a particular state indicates that a different class of drug is the bigger problem in terms of drugs other than alcohol in that particular state, and that class of drug is something that people use during the day, morning hours, then doing a sobriety checkpoint to identify drug-impaired drivers who are using the class of drug that's the biggest problem in your particular state might be an interesting way for law enforcement to try to find these people, to identify them. So that's just one of many examples that will be in that report. We just completed a report looking at policies both within and outside of highway safety that could help address the prescription and over-the-counter drug misuse and abuse problem as it relates to transportation safety. That will serve as the basis of the first of two national forums that AAA is doing. One first with the National Academies of Science looking at research, and the second with the Governor's Highway Safety Association to look at policy recommendations to help address prescribed and over-the-counter drugs as it relates to driver safety. The state drug driving data is essentially that report of 19 recommendations to improve state data systems. We are doing a catalog of all 50 states plus DC to look at is a particular state compliant with this recommendation? And if the answer is no, what specifically does a state have to do to become compliant? Which I think will make it really easy for people at the state level to then understand what needs to change. So we're trying to enable them. And then the last would be understanding sort of what we know and what we don't know about oral fluid testing. I think there is a wide misconception, even among law enforcement, that if everybody were to use oral fluid testing, that it would allow us to treat the drug-impaired driver the way that we do the alcohol-impaired driver. And while oral fluid testing can be a great tool for law enforcement, it won't allow them to treat those drivers the same. It's not going to allow us to sort of give per se laws power. So I will stop and close there with just an acknowledgement that this is a very complex issue, even outside the scope of just cannabis and opioids. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Paul, and I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for hosting this and co-hosting this with Sam and Mr. Attorney General. Thank you for your continued interest in this issue, so many other issues, but this issue in particular, so engaged in all of these meetings. It means a lot to us, and it's strange for me to talk in front of so many of my mentors and colleagues and former colleagues and whatnot, but I want to thank them for all of their work in the field and everything that's going on. especially Dr. Madras. I want to thank you for your service on the President's Opioid Commission and Commission on Drug Addiction. And what's interesting about that, which I think is part of the discussion, is that we forget that that was a commission on drug addiction and the opioid epidemic, not only the opioid epidemic. And I think what's critical, and I'm saying this as a guy who runs an organization focused on one drug, but what's critical is that these are not just issues about one drug. I happen to be the guy running the organization on one drug because no one else was doing it. So there I was. But this is obviously a multi-drug issue. And I think Jake laid that out very well. And I want to thank AAA for their really stepping up to the plate on this issue, on a difficult issue that's nuanced and politically risky and tough, when it would be much easier to do what 99% of other organizations who should be involved in this space are doing, and that's totally ignore what's happening and with changing laws and ignore this. So it really means a lot to us, Jake, to have AAA as a partner. Many of you know about SAM, so I'm not going to dwell too much, but essentially we are an evidence-based organization that is really trying to spread the message that there is a false dichotomy between prohibition, criminalization on the one hand, and legalization on the other with regards to marijuana, that somehow we don't have to be caught up in this false choice, and that's a partisan sort of false choice. So we're a nonpartisan organization that work with multiple health and other organizations. We also have a active 501c4 organization that works on the advocacy side of this, partly because of the reason I just said, no one else is, but also because we think it's critical that we have smarter marijuana policies that don't fall into either extreme. What's so interesting about the polling that Jake brought up, which is talked about a lot, is that we were frustrated, I'm going off script a little, but I think it's an important point. We were frustrated with these polls that simply asked people, are you in favor of legalizing marijuana, yes or no? And it wasn't, first of all, clear, are you talking about use? Are you talking about sales? What products are you talking about? Not only was it unclear there, it wasn't clear whether you were talking about medical, decriminalization of possession, legalization of sales. What were you getting at? And so we commissioned polls with the same people that did the polls we didn't like, Mason-Dixon, Emerson College, and others. And when they redid polls, and many of them did them on their own, they didn't even want our funding. They liked the idea, which we preferred, and ran with it. When they did these polls, they found that support for legalization didn't hover around 60-some%. It hovered around between 30 and 40% when you gave people the choice of decriminalization of possession. And so often when people are voting for these referenda, you know, you don't get a choice. You can't say, well, yes with a caveat, right, or no with a caveat. It's yes or no, and you're getting the message, whatever the proponents or opponents want you to hear, especially the ones that are funded the most. And I think that has been a critical issue that's been overlooked, is the distinction between different policies that are out there. As I said, focusing on one drug, you know, opioids today, but if history is a guide, with every opioid epidemic, and we've had a few in this country, they're always followed by a stimulant epidemic. And right now we are seeing a reemergence of methamphetamine, a reemergence of cocaine and seizures that we hadn't seen before. We sort of thought, well, Columbia's fix, we're done. We obviously aren't done. And in fact, last month, more people died in Ohio, which is one of the highest states of drug overdose deaths, from cocaine cut with fentanyl, obviously, and the fentanyls are obviously an extremely dangerous class of synthetic opioids, but cut with fentanyl versus opioids alone. And so, you know, again, coming from the guy who's an organization that focuses on one issue, it's important not to just focus on one issue, and to remember that, you know, we sort of have a flavor of the month, which is good for politicians. And hey, it was crack in the 80s, and it was designer drugs, MDMA in the 90s, along with a little bit of heroin and meth in the 2000s. But I think what's important is to realize where the history is, and to realize that it's important that this is drug addiction. And the commission that Dr. Madras and only a few others served on was a drug addiction commission that looked at this from a broad point of view, which I think is important. Marijuana, though, is sort of a special one. It remains a constant issue because it's the most widely abused drug. I think it's also the most widely misunderstood drug. We don't see lobbies for heroin users protesting their right to inject heroin on Capitol Hill. I mean, we just don't. We don't see we don't even see alcoholics on Capitol Hill saying we shouldn't have a BAC level or anything like that. This is something very interesting with marijuana that isn't with the other drugs. And I think part of it is just the misinformation that's out there. And a lot of it, most of it is that there is now a growing group of people who know they can make a lot of money with misinformation. And we think we're seeing the big tobacco nightmare happen all over again, just kind of in slow motion. And hate to use the analogy of a car crash, but here we are. It's a car crash in slow motion. And the question is, are we going to wait? Is it going to take 100 years like it did for tobacco for us to realize this is not a good thing to promote? And do we have to learn the hard way, or can we figure some things out with history? And we hope that we can. So we do all kinds of activities. We have a summit in April you're welcome to in Atlanta. We have fact sheets. We do a lessons learned on marijuana legalization. That report's going to come out. The new one we're really excited about is going to come out in a couple of weeks. We also have done cost studies on marijuana. And one thing I think is so interesting, and this is cost related to marijuana-related car crashes in Canada. A partner organization, the Canadian Centre for Substance Abuse and Addiction, did this study and found that in Canada alone, in 1 year, cannabis-related car crashes, and this was a conservative estimate because, what is caused, what's not. They were very conservative. About $1 billion a year in lost social costs. Now, we hear the justification for legalization all the time. The chief justification is not we want to use pot, because most people don't want to use it. The chief justification is revenue, right? Revenue for schools, and hey, I don't use marijuana, but I'll benefit from legalization because we'll have a new park or a new school or whatever. What's not talked about are the costs. And we have just completed our second cost report on the overall costs of marijuana in the state of Connecticut. We did one in Rhode Island. We started with the smaller states that are a little easier. These are very difficult studies to do, as Terry will tell you, to do these cost studies of drugs. But I thought this was very interesting, about $1 billion. Each death on the road, they estimated, was in US dollars, about $6 million for a death, premature death on the road. And if you look at the hundreds of people, thousands, that are dying on the roads today, one of the main reasons being marijuana, it flies in the face of this idea that it doesn't cost anything. It also flies in the face of the idea that marijuana has never killed anybody, which is what we hear a lot about, because there isn't a fatal overdose from marijuana. I remind people there is also not a fatal overdose from tobacco. There's nobody dying of an overdose of smoking too many cigarettes. We would never say that cigarettes don't kill people, and I think it's important to realize and remember that. I think also something Jake brought up, which is very we can pretend that we sort of practiced this before, was this idea of street THC versus federal. And I would say we can add another versus on that, the third one, which is the THC available in quote-unquote legal states. By the way, I say quote-unquote legal states because I know it's tough to remember. We have a Controlled Substances Act that says marijuana is illegal. The state can't go against that. I know it's hard to believe it these days, but we do have that. And so it is quote-unquote legal because it's still all illegal. But the quote-unquote legal regulated THC, we're talking about preparations and concentrations that I like to say Cheech and Chong could never have come up with, because it was way after their time. The candies, the cookies, the gummies, the 25% off is it's a brand new one in Colorado. That's Pop Rocks, like the old Pot Rocks, like the old Pop Rocks from when I was growing up. And but of course you have to remember that says medical only. So next time you should ask your doctor for some Pop Rocks for your backache, and there you will go. But also the Kush Pop, all of these things that were never thought of. And I did a debate earlier, and somebody was saying, well, Kevin, at least the cartels were so bad. And of course they are. But Pablo Escobar didn't come up with gummy bears. I mean, that was not an idea from the cartel. They couldn't come up with something like that. The American marketing machine did. And that's what's to remember when we're talking about legalization. It's not about smoking a joint in your basement and falling asleep as an adult and sort of doing what you used to do in Woodstock. It is about a massive marketing campaign that is leading us to believe that marijuana is not only safer than alcohol, which is something that they promoted, but safe, period. And not only safe, good for you, positive. And how can something be bad for you if it's actually medicine? So we've launched, one of the campaigns we launched, which Dana will talk about, is High Means DUI. I'll let her talk about it, but we want to raise awareness, even in quote-unquote legal states, that this is a growing problem. And just because it might be legal in your state, it doesn't mean it's safe. We are concerned with what's going on in Colorado One estimate shows an average annual rate growth of marijuana-related car crashes of 14% a year. Overall, about an 88% increase since commercialization. And NHTSA's estimated 66%, and there are a couple different data sets on that. We now know that DUIDs just overall have risen in Colorado, but 3/4 of that are DUIDs involving marijuana. We also know that the attitudes in Colorado did a different survey, the Department of Transportation. They found that 55% of people in their survey said that they've used marijuana, that they can drive safely under the drug's influence. 55% thinks that they use it and it's safe. 72% who have used marijuana believe it's safer to drive under its influence than under the influence of alcohol. And, you know, these analogies and these kind of either or are also false analogies. It's like the idea that, you know, well, you have to choose. Do you want to do the one that's safer or not? And that's sort of like saying you have to jump out of the building. Do you want to jump out of the 5th floor or the 9th floor? Well, I mean, maybe the 5th floor is safer, but they're both unsafe and they shouldn't be promoted. And but the lobby is using that alcohol argument very well, probably because alcohol is known to have so many negative side effects because we've dealt with the carnage of a legal, marketed, normalized drug. And so the idea that now we're saying, wow, alcohol is so much worse, that's because we all know somebody who struggled with alcohol. Less than 10% of people, fewer than 10% use marijuana. It's harder to know somebody who's had a problem with marijuana. So our general macro experience is different with alcohol versus marijuana. And so we're obviously very concerned about that. Let's see, here we go. Where we're at nationally, we've already talked about almost 50% of nighttime weekend drivers with marijuana in their system. NSDA says that 21 million people 16 or older drove under the influence of alcohol in the past year, and 12 million under the influence of illegal drugs, the vast majority of it being marijuana. In Washington, D.C., they've done some data. 1 in 5 fatal crashes in D.C. are related to marijuana. That's since D.C. has implemented a kind of modified legalization. And that's really close to the number of people dead because of alcohol driving under the influence, 28%. Washington State, as Jake just talked about, also in Oregon and in Alaska. You know, the problem with some of these newer states that have legalized, we don't have great data at all from them. And in Alaska, it's like pulling teeth to get any of this data. But we just heard yesterday there's been something like a 5% increase since legalization in Anchorage alone. But they are not testing at all if you're above 0.08. There's zero testing with the THC, which is obviously a problem. We've talked about it. They're openly admitting that, and they talk about that very, very openly. I like to talk about the new folks that are pushing drugs these days. They're not your corner drug dealer. They're not the person that if you close your eyes and imagine who's selling addictive drugs. These are people with adept marketing skills, with Ivy League MBAs, and their goal is to push something and to talk about how something is safe so that essentially they can get rich. And I think we really, really have to remember our history when it comes to this. One thing I like to remember Dr. Nora Volkow, who's not here, from NIDA say, talking about regular marijuana use and the problems, but then this is, I think, one of the most poignant things I've read in the literature. She says, however, the effects of a drug, legal or illegal, on individual health are determined not only by its pharmacologic properties, but also by its availability and social acceptability. In this respect, legal drugs, alcohol and tobacco, offer a sobering perspective, accounting for the greatest burden of disease associated with drugs. So that's an amazing thing. She's saying alcohol and tobacco, much more than opioids, which alcohol and tobacco kill 10 times the number of people than opioids every year. And that's also 10 times the number of Americans we lost in the entire Vietnam War, for some perspective, every year from our legal drugs. She says, not because they are more dangerous than illegal drugs. We're not saying cigarettes are more dangerous than heroin, but because their legal status allows for more widespread exposure. And I think that's when we talk about public health and we talk about macro exposure and what's going on in populations around the country, I think it's really important to remember that it's not only what happens to you if you use dose for dose, but what's going on in society as a result of so many more people using those. Our website is learnaboutsam.org, and we thank the Heritage Foundation for hosting us.
Candace?
So I'm not going to give you a single statistic. I am going to ask how many of you all are involved in the legislative process? Oh, a few. Okay, good. Well, they asked me to talk about how to get a law passed, and since I've done that so many times, I actually look forward to sharing that with you. Let me tell you a little bit about We Save Lives. I founded it about 5 years ago. We focus on the 3 Ds, drunk, drugged, and distracted driving. Ironically, in my family, we've been impacted by all 3 Ds. My son was run over by a woman on Valium when he was 5 years old. He was in a coma. He was permanently brain injured. As you know, my daughter was killed by a drunk driver many years ago. And about 2 or 3 years ago, I was impacted by a distracted driver, totaled my car and ruined my back. So I have personal experience with all of the 3Ds, and I have as much passion for all of the 3Ds. So we have some of our campaigns. We have a campaign called But Not While Driving. We're asking all of you to add on to your iPhones in your signature block, but not while driving, to give people a clear message about distracted driving. On drunk driving, we did a campaign called Reflections from Inside. It's a video produced for us by Young and Rubicon, won a big international award, has been seen by over 200 or 300 million people around the world. It's still going around the world. You can see it on our website. Cops use it in training, schools use it in driver's ed. It's really fabulous. It's a true story of a man who killed a police officer drunk. And on drugged driving, we've been doing things on this for the last 5 years, and I'll talk about oral fluid testing in terms of trying to get a law passed. But we have recently partnered with SAM, which we're very excited about, on this particular issue, and we've developed a petition about marijuana and driving, which Dana is going to talk to you more about, which is also on our website. So let's talk about changing laws. So when I started this almost 40 years ago, so I'm going to jam 40 years of experience in 8 minutes, at that time, alcohol, drunk driving was socially acceptable, very much like distracted driving and drug driving are today. And so it was up to us to change the attitude. But unlike drugged driving, we actually had facts and figures on how many people were being killed in alcohol-related crashes. So we couldn't just go out and say, all right, we need to pass this law and toughen the penalties because, A, people weren't being arrested, people weren't being tested, nobody knew what the data was. So we had to develop a bit of a different strategy on drugged driving. Now, if you remember, if any of you are old enough to remember, way back when on drunk driving, I actually called for a presidential task force, governor's task forces, and countywide task forces. All were given. We had governor's task forces in almost all of the states. This was to focus attention on solutions for drunk driving. We had a presidential commission, thanks to President Ronald Reagan and Elizabeth Dole, that again focused on solutions. I've done the same thing on drugged driving, but I don't have a massive organization behind me, so it hasn't gone very far. But I sort of look at the March 15th date as a beginning in that process of bringing all the stakeholders together. So we developed our own strategy on drug driving, and the first thing we realized is we didn't have data. And so it was going to be hard to convince the public we had a serious problem. On drunk driving, we had data, but we didn't have convictions and we didn't have penalties. So we decided if we were going to convince the public that drunk driving was a serious problem, we had to toughen our penalties, and we did. I was personally involved in more than 750 laws around the country, and we did. We got mandatory jail, all kinds of wonderful things. And we, at that time, 1.0 was not a per se. We got 1.0 as a per se. Drugged driving, we thought, maybe the first thing we should do is focus on getting the data. So how do we get the data? Well, I happen to be very familiar with the oral fluid devices, and so my thought was, why not go after testing and see if we couldn't get states to implement more testing procedures, and these particular devices were a good way to do it, so why not try and get these devices used in every state, or at least allowed where they could go in and do oral fluid testing, because not every state allows for oral fluid testing. So we approached California was one of the states, Vermont was another. So one of the things that you want to do is you want to determine first what laws you want to pass, and you want to research like hell to find out if these laws have been passed anywhere, and if they have they worked or not? And if not, why not? You also need to find out what your opposition is like. I did that on drunk driving many years ago, and I remember when I had a meeting, I called a meeting for everybody, ACLU, the alcohol industry, prohibition groups, everyone to come in. At that time we didn't have an office in the back of a church. with law enforcement and sit down and talk about what I wanted to do and what problems there would be if I wanted to do this. I wanted mandatory jail on a first offense. And everybody kept saying, you can't do that. You can't have the opposition come in and do. And I said, why not? I mean, I was really naive. And I thought, why not? Let's find out first why they oppose whatever it is we want to do. And let's see if we can't find common ground. And maybe there's a way to compromise. It was a fascinating meeting. ACLU said, we're not going to touch you with the 10-foot pole. You're a mother whose child was killed. And that was it for them. Alcohol industry said pretty much the same thing and didn't until we came to 21 and excise taxes on alcohol. And then they came out in full force. Well, they won on excise taxes. They did not win on 21. So anyway, we went into California and said, okay, let's get a bill introduced. We found a legislator, which was very difficult to do. And so I'm going to always advise you to try and find a legislator of the majority party. Many of you probably already know this, and somebody who's high up there, well respected by their colleagues, and maybe chairman of a particular committee that you need to endorse this bill or to help pass this bill. Then after we got our legislator, I'm a big believer in, I don't care if there's, emails and internet and studies online. This is an old packet, by the way, so it's an old logo, but of putting a packet of information together that includes talking points, which I have for later this afternoon. We had talking points. We list our resources on the talking points. We have any information that may back it up. For example, on oral fluid, we might have a recent study. We would have whatever information pertains to that particular issue, we would put in a packet. In Colorado, when we went into Colorado to do 0%, we had a binder with, tabs and everything on all the different studies. And we actually had at the last part of the binder was victim stories that they could read about people who had been impacted by this crime. And by the way, I want to inform you that drugged and drunk driving is a crime. We never, ever call them accidents. We will call them crashes until they have been investigated, and then we call them crimes. So we don't want to give excuses to those who do these things, to the perpetrators, by saying it was just an accident. It wasn't. So we have our list, we have our packet, and then we also would ask people from their district to go visit the different legislators on the committees. And in our case in California, we had a victim with us, a young gal whose father was killed by a drugged driver on, not heroin, maybe cocaine. I can't actually, it wasn't marijuana, but I can't remember the drug. But it was one of those drugs. And she was fantastic. She's one of our speakers and volunteers. And she came with us to meet with every legislator. She told her story. It had an impact. She also testified. We allowed her to testify versus someone like myself because we thought it might be more impactful. In this case, because we were doing oral fluids, we actually had a demonstration at the state capitol because a lot of the legislators weren't familiar with the devices, didn't understand how they worked, et cetera. So we had some companies come in and do a demonstration. And actually, the young man who volunteered to be tested was from the local cannabis chapter and agreed. And his brother ran the chapter, and he came in and agreed in public in front of the press. We had the press there and the legislators to allow us to show how to use an oral swab. And it's so funny because I was sitting sort of behind, and Christine was there, who's a well-known toxicologist. And this was, we used the Alere device, now called the Abbott device, I'm not sure, but Alere device. And he tested positive not only for marijuana, but for some opioids as well. And we were trying to keep it from the press and not let everybody know. And we were trying, it was really great fun. And, because we were trying to let the press see the results on, so they, anyway, it was a lot of fun. And so, anyway, so we had a demonstration so they would understand exactly how the devices worked. And then we went forward and, went out and talked to every different legislator there was. Ironically, what kept happening is the national cannabis associations, I don't remember the particular ones, kept bombarding the chief legislator that we needed on our side with counter information that was mostly bogus, to be honest. And so we had to be very quick whenever one of these studies came in. We had to have sort of somebody on the inside let us know what it was. We had to do that at the same time we were doing 21. We had to do that way back when. The same thing had to be really quick and immediately come up with the counters to that. We put fact sheets together called myths and myths, facts, and questions, whatever. We had about 3 different fact sheets together, and every time a study would come in from this group here in DC, we'd come back with our own facts to counter those facts. I'm a firm believer in leaving science out of what you're doing as much as possible and keeping it very simple and easy for them to understand. For us, for advocates, the other groups can bring the science into it. But for us, we're there because we have a passion for the issue, because we believe in common sense, and we all want to save lives. And in our group, as well as other groups, we have many victims that have been impacted by these tragedies. So our feeling is we bring the victims, we bring the stories, we bring the common sense, we bring the studies that are easy to understand. We don't overwhelm them with statistics and all kinds of scientific data, because they will get that from others, and they should get that from others. We would have the most recent research on the issue. The other thing that I think is really important right now, anyway, because 40 years ago it was much different. We have social media. We didn't then. We had a direct mail campaign, so we were able to go out to our members. But now we have social media. We actually do not encourage our people to email legislators as much as write them letters and to go visit them. And the reason for that is legislators tell me they're sick of emails. They're overwhelmed with emails. They don't read half of them. And our feeling is legislators care more if you actually take the time to write a letter. I'll usually give them a sample letter and advise them if they have a story to tell their story. Better yet, if they can go visit them in their district or their staff, we encourage them to do that. Once the bill has actually been introduced, we do launch a social media campaign. We've actually been involved, I'm very proud to say, in a number of bills recently in the last 2 years on all 3 issues that have passed. And we honestly believe it's because of social media and our social media campaign. We're the only advocacy group that I know of that has, that actually advertises and boosts our posts on social media to targeted audiences. I work with about 60 groups. I know that none of them do, but we do. And so we'll go after, for example, we have a bill in Vermont now, so we'll go after Vermont whenever the bill is coming up on different issues. And we'll let people know, you need to contact this person, you need to contact that person. Again, we link them to the particular legislators. We encourage them to write letters. We do the same thing on Twitter. We do a big take action. We also firmly believe, and I'll tell you, if there were any legislators here, I think I'm going to write an article for legislators on how to get a bill passed. But one of the things that I found that was most helpful for us anyway, because we don't always introduce a bill. We Save Lives doesn't always introduce a bill. We support our partners who do. We do some, but we also support our partners who do, is when the legislator staff member keeps us informed and lets us know constantly what's going on, what committee is going to, where the opposition is coming from. We just went through that with the textilizer issue in New York with the ACLU. So if they keep us informed, then we can keep our membership informed, and we have members all over. Plus, we can keep our partners informed. Although We Save Lives, unlike MAD, which MAD was in the beginning a chapter organization, it is no more. We believe we have the same impact because we have partners all around the country and in other countries as well. Now, they don't all focus on just one issue, such as drugged driving or drunk driving. Many of them focus on distracted, but I have to tell you, sometimes they'll come through for us on an issue not related particularly to their campaign, which is true. I mean, it's really great. So when you're meeting with legislators, we always ask them how they're going to vote. And if they're supportive, we ask them to help with those who aren't. And one thing that you should do is we also tell them how excited we're going to be to tell our thousands of followers how they're going to vote. And we just can't wait to share that information with our followers. So, if they're going to vote yes, boy, we're going to get that information right out there right away so they can, get some good vibes from it, because we can't give them money like the opposition can. That's not our purview. So we try and build up the goodwill that will come from their voting in our direction. And keeping in close contact. And then I'm real big on coalitions. And I've done this over and over and over again, continue to do it today. We're doing it with the marijuana high, DUID petition. We did it with the distracted driving bill in California. I believe in forming coalitions. I think the more people you have that can be supportive, the better it is. I also believe in working with the opposition. As I did with Matt, I worked with the alcohol industry. I would tell you right now, I would have no problem talking to the cannabis industry about the issues that things that they're doing that we disagree with. So those are my suggestions, and I'm really done. Thank you.
Thank you. Dana.
Hi. Well, I'm going to be brief, and I think I have a PowerPoint coming up here somewhere. There it is. Whoops. And I'll be really brief because I know we're kind of approaching the end of our time. But one of the things that I've heard over and over on the first panel, and I really wrote down when Ms. King was talking about the March 15th call to action, was public awareness to drive action. Candace talked about action. The first panel talked about getting better and talking about marijuana and impairment. And so that's a big element of what our new campaign at SAM, marijuana-impaired driving, high means DUI, is all about. There's 3 key elements to that campaign. And I'll briefly walk through. We don't need to talk about this. We heard all about the data. I don't need to go on with the data. Thank you, Jake. We use your data. And we don't need to do original research. All of you, many of you are doing that, and we're glad to keep putting that out. But we feel like we need to be able to communicate to the general public, to these DFC coalitions that so many of us work with that are all over the country, and they're funded to be change agents, to do policy systems and environmental change. And but they get bogged down and they get afraid. So we need to be able to help them communicate in simple terms, take these major studies. Dr. Madras, we have read so much of what, I feel like I know you, you've never met me, but you have your own folder in my computer. I mean, but that's too much for people. We need to break it down. So we're trying to create initiative that will communicate with folks who can be called to action, who can be the change agents, who can be advocates in their communities and to their representatives, many of whom will never come to Washington, D.C. unless they're going to the DFC conference that's over at the harbor. So the other piece to our campaign is to bring voice to people who have been personally impacted. I want you to hear from somebody who is a great spokesperson, much like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, did such a good job in giving voice to victims. We are helping those victims become advocates, taking what they've experienced and turn that into a call for action. So I'm going to have you meet Corinne. Corinne, this is coming up. I see. It should be. Okay, someone else is doing that. The great and mighty.
My daughter Jennifer had just graduated from college. She was just 22 years old, on the verge of a wonderful career. She wanted to actually go out in the world and fight drugs. She began her first job, not in her field of study, but she was called into work as a district manager into one of the stores when an alarm went off. As Jennifer made her way in, she was T-boned at an intersection by a man who was traveling 82 miles an hour through a red light. My daughter's car was pushed across the road through a bunch of shrubbery, and then through the doors of a lube stop building, and the building collapsed on top of her car. My daughter lost her life that night. The man that did this was uninjured, but he was high on medical marijuana. He was given a very light sentence of just 2 years in jail. He only spent 17 months there. And now he's out and he's off parole.
Utilizing earned media, free media, engaging voices in action at the neighborhood level, at the community level, where we can really get the media to come out. We used Corrine in a media launch for the campaign in November. And really, it was just to launch our website. We saw it as a soft launch. We were just going to kind of practice with the website. And we ended up getting so much media. And then that media carried forward because we had a couple of networks, not just local TV. And so we can do this. It doesn't cost a ton of money. And we can help move the dialogue to support the policy change. That brings us to the next element of our campaign. Oops. Oh, I didn't mean to get there. Let's see if we can get out of that back to the PowerPoint. Oh, there it is. So the next big element of our initiative is to develop model legislation, model policies that can be utilized at a state or federal level. That have the key elements that we're looking for. Enhancements for the poly drug use, or alcohol and marijuana together, for mandatory data collection, and components to address victim rights within that legislation. And we are not advocating for per se limits. It's very easy for advocates to not quite understand the difference between alcohol policy and the marijuana policies. And some of what was articulated on the first panel, I was taking horrific notes because we need to boil that down to key phrases that community-based coalitions who are known, those are folks who are known by their local legislators and have a voice to carry and are known in those legislative field offices and are known by those representatives because they vote for those representatives. They have weight. They can influence those decisions at that local level. So the really changing the norms and attitudes through our messaging and through our campaign at that local level, and utilizing people who are engaged at the periphery but don't really know what to do. And so changing norms and attitudes, developing model policy, and then mobilizing those folks to be advocates for change and helping them understand how to change laws and engage them in doing so. Just a quick little peek, because I know we're out of time, at the website. And I encourage everyone to go there. You'll find the petition under Act Now, the tab Act Now.
Ours is under Take Action.
Well, this actually is going to go to your website, Kennedy. Yeah. So if you'll scroll down on that page for me, and then whoops, go right up a tiny bit and click, and that takes you up just above that picture, right there in the bold. That will take you to the petition. And so we're trying to make it really easy. There's so many websites, so much information, and we're trying to really facilitate making it easy for people to take action. This page will also contain shortly those sample letters to the editor, sample letters to their legislators, toolkits that can be used at the local level, and the model policies. You'll see throughout the website the use of the media. You don't need to continue clicking around. I know we're out of time. We'll just go back to the end of the website. The end of the PowerPoint, if you don't mind. Thank you. At the very bottom there. Thank you. Please look for us, High Means DUI, on Facebook and on the web. And we've just started getting some Twitter messaging going out. We really need to work on our messaging. Like we never talk about marijuana legalization. We only talk about commercialization. We don't talk about marijuana-impaired car accidents. We only talk about crashes. So we're really trying to shape the way that the community and our community coalitions that already exist. We're not necessarily trying to recreate the wheel. Those community coalitions are out there. They're already working on marijuana, and they want to be more effective at doing so. And we want to give them the tools to do that and help change policies. I mean, who can't get behind a zero tolerance for anyone under the age of 21? We can keep talking about the rest of the policy structure for adults, but let's just start at low-hanging fruit. We have zero tolerance for alcohol for anyone under 21. Can't we all agree that that's a good starting point? Stay with us. We're just getting started, and we look forward to working with everyone over the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel members. We have heard a lot of different possible solutions to this problem. I hope that one or more of them are something that you can take and work with. So thank you. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, Heritage.
Graduate of the Harvard Medical School, Dr. Robert DuPont is the president of the nonprofit Institute for Behavior and Health. Previously, he served as the first director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and he was the second White House drug chief before they started calling them drug czars. Since 1980, he has been a clinical professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University School of Medicine. As a practicing psychiatrist for over 4 decades, he has specialized in addiction medicine and anxiety. Dr. DuPont has dedicated his professional career to preventing people from starting down the path towards drug abuse and helping the ones who unfortunately make the mistake and go down. Please join me in welcoming Dr. DuPont.
Are you still talking about being at 12:30?
Yeah. Go ahead.
See what I can do. I was scheduled for half an hour, and now it's 8 minutes. I'm kind of struggling with that, folks. Well, I want to start off by saying how grateful I am to Heritage and to Paul Arkin for this. There's a long history of Heritage leadership in this area, and this is a great example of it. I have learned a lot this morning from listening to the speakers. It's been a terrific experience and something we've put together, something that will be useful to a lot of people for a long period of time on the Heritage website. It's really terrific, and I'm just proud to be here, particularly with Ed Meese, who's up here and has been doing this for a long time with Heritage. I'm very grateful. And also just make a mention that Candace was talking about people who've had the experience and their impact. I want to just mention Ed Wood, who is a person from Colorado who had this experience, who has set the standard really for quality of his work and his passion. He is a national treasure coming out of that experience. I started in this field 50 years ago, this July 1st, 50 years ago. Right here in this town. My inspiration were 2 people, John Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. I was a dedicated Democrat. I happened to be in the district government when Richard Nixon was elected. And all the good ideas I had that went nowhere under Lyndon Johnson were all of a sudden funded under Richard Nixon. That had a big impact on me, in my view. I am proud to say I think I'm the only person who's known all 17 White House drug czars, all 15 heads of DEA, and all 5 heads of NIDA in my experience. And I'm proud to work with each of the administrations and see this drug issue as not a partisan issue, but something that can unite us So I'm particularly clear about that. Now, let me say that there's a bigger context to what we're talking about when we talk about marijuana and driving, and that is the modern drug abuse epidemic. I'll just say a word or two in the shortness of time, but I wanted the context. This is something new in the world. This has not been around before, and it started in the 1960s, and it is still evolving and growing in the world. And that has to do with using chemicals to artificially stimulate brain reward. It's biology. And what's happened is we've got a lot of people in various kinds of business, legal and illegal, who are providing and supporting chemicals that superstimulate brain reward. And it used to be it was just alcohol and tobacco, and then a few other drugs on the side, but that's not true anymore. When I started, it with the two drugs we talked about were heroin and marijuana. How interesting, how similar that is to today, 50 years later. But the menu is entirely different. We now have hundreds. Bertha was talking about 700 new synthetic drugs. The illegal market is moved very rapidly away from agricultural products to synthetics. It's easier for them to do that, and they avoid the testing because it's hard to identify it. So I want you to think about this as a larger context. Marijuana is a big part of it, central to it, but it's not the whole story. The other thing is the policy conflicts that are just terrible confusions that we want to say, is it a public health problem or a law enforcement? Do you believe in treatment or do you believe in health? And that is a really stupid way to think about drug policy. We actually need both, and drug driving is a terrific example of how we need both. And the same thing as Kevin was talking about, the crazy dichotomy of legalization versus prohibition. Come on. We can do better than that to think about what we want to do. Now, I want to quickly, in view of this time, make a couple of points. First of all, it's no doubt that the problem of drug-impaired driving is a huge public safety and public health problem. There is no doubt that what we're doing now is inadequate. And I want to be sure we get those two things clear in our minds. No doubt about that. What's going on. The BAC .08 analogy for drugs is stymieing efforts. It stops us in our tracks, and it dominates the discussion. Get over it, folks. No other drug, not just marijuana, it's not marijuana that's special, it's alcohol that's special. You will not solve any problem in drug driving with a per se limit. Never. You don't need more research. When I started at NIDA, the second research monograph we published in 1975 was on drug driving. Drug driving in 1975. This is not a new topic. And people say we need research. Well, we've got a lot of research already here. Also, the issue of marijuana is, I've said BAC 08 is stymied. So is the conflicts over marijuana. It just gets us all tangled up in about marijuana and thinking about what it is, and we miss the fact that the drug driving problem is a lot bigger than marijuana. We need to understand that. And also something that's happening just crazy about our focus on one drug or another drug. There are almost no people who use one drug. They don't exist. The opiate addicts, the overdose deaths of opioids are not an opioid problem. They're a drug problem. 95% of them have other drugs when they die. 95%. But that's true across the board. All of our studies are drug by drug and dose and very careful. People aren't doing that. That's not what's really happening. It's multiple drugs are what are going on. And the biology of that is really important. These people using the drugs are doing research in brain biology. And they have discovered that doing multiple drugs is better for them than just doing more of one. You know, there's no research in that. Nothing. There's no research about the overdose death potential of multiple drugs because all of our studies are single drugs. This is completely nuts. Our message about alcohol is clear. Don't drink and drive. Notice that's not a message that says don't drive drunk. Our law is don't drive drunk, meaning 0.08. But that's not what we say. That message we're saying don't drink and drive is the right message. That makes a big difference. And we need exactly that same message about drugs. Don't use drugs and drive. That's the right message we need to know. I want to come back and end here. I've got so many other things I want to talk about, but I'm going to zero in and pick on some things that were already said. First of all, we need some simple things we're going to do. All the going around, all the complexity, we have got to be simple. And I'm going to give you 4 that are on the programs that you've had. I was happy to work with Paul about this. The first one is kind of simple, and that was mentioned earlier, and that is zero tolerance for marijuana or any other drug under the age of 21. That's a huge step. That is really big. Who's against that? There is no constituency for kids using drugs. So that's, talk about low-hanging fruit. Second of all, test all drivers arrested for impairment for drugs as well as alcohol. How complicated is that? It's expensive, I don't understand that. But at least set the standard. That's what we want to do. That's how we'll know what the heck's going on. The same thing with the FARS data. It's really important and very simple. The other one is to pick up on Marilyn Hustis has been doing this for years, is look at the oral fluids testing. It is the future of where we're going. It really is, and we need to build on that. And it's a good technology, it's accessible, it can be developed, but it's really very important to do that. And the last one is administrative license revocation. To take the license of the driver who was arrested as impaired. Now, I want to go through a simple thing, step with you, step by step, because it's so important. People don't get tested unless they're arrested. The first step is a probable cause to pull a driver over. Something has to happen to pull that driver over. And then the officer does some test of impairment, like the field sobriety test or the DRE or the ARIDE, to establish that there's an impairment. At that point, the person is arrested. That's when the testing takes place. People get very confused about that and what's going on. That is what happens. And when you do, in that context of it, then when you have a positive drug test, you have a different situation than just going down the road and testing people willy-nilly. And if we just keep that in mind, we're talking about people who have been arrested for being impaired. I understand that the field sobriety test is not good at getting all marijuana users. I got it. But it gets a hell of a lot of them. And let's do that. Let's do that. It doesn't have to be real complicated for that. And I don't know who's going to think that's a bad idea to test arrested drivers for impairment for marijuana. Maybe they think that is a bad idea. I think it's a very good idea. And I think it's part of the package that we need to do. Now, I want to just end by saying, I was thinking about the fact that I'm president of the Institute for Behavior and Health. We have a website, Stop Drug Driving. So I encourage you to look at Stop Drug Driving. Every 2 months, we have a group of experts in drug driving talking about it. It's a wonderful thing for experts. I'd be happy to any of you want to join in our teleconferences. It's a community that we have of people who are interested. It works together, and it's really something I'm very proud of. And I want to end with one last point. I started off with the epidemic. And we heard, for example, about opioids, that the first opioid that people used was a prescription opioid, 80% of the time. What's unspoken in that is that before that first opioid, they had used other drugs. most of the people, almost all of the people who have opioid dependence started drug use as teenagers. That primes the brain for later exposure to prescription drugs and all the opioid things. Go back to that starting point, is in adolescence. And one of the things that IBH is focused on is an initiative we call One Choice. And this is for all adolescents, anybody under 21. The crucial question is, am I going to use a drug or am I not going to use a drug? And what we've shown is that the percentage of youth who've made the decision in the United States has increased steadily for 40 years. Now in the United States, 26% of high school seniors who've never used any alcohol, any tobacco, any marijuana, or other drugs. It was 3% in 1983. And used in the last month, it was 16% in 1983. It's 51% of high school seniors in the US. We're not inventing a trend. This trend is there. We need to emphasize it and focus on the health goal for youth is not to use any drug, because the vulnerability of that brain is going to last for a lifetime. Protect that brain. And if we can get our effort of drug driving to recognize the prevention goal and how important that is. So remember that term, one choice. And what we want to do is get those kids who've made that choice to speak up. They're silent now. We want them to talk to other kids about why they made that choice, how that's working out for them, so they can inspire some other kids to do that. And that, who is in favor, again, of kids using any drug? The alcohol industry, the tobacco industry, the marijuana people, all at least say they don't want kids to use drugs. Let's get ourselves organized around that. Thank you very much.
Before I go, I just want again to thank the speakers we've had today, not just for the time they spent today, not just for the time they spent preparing for today, but for all the time they spent in their lives doing the things that they talked about. They are doing God's work. They are trying to save lives. Soldiers aren't the only ones. Police officers, nurses, doctors, EMTs, they're not the only ones who can save lives. Everyone who spoke here today is invested in that mission. And for that, I want to thank them all, not just on behalf of Heritage, but on behalf of myself as well. Thank you. We are adjourned.